Marlene Warren was born on April 15, 1950, in Michigan, USA. She grew up without a father and since her teenage years dreamed of having a large and close-knit family. Very soon, that dream came true. The girl married a man named John and they had 2 sons. But just a few years later, an unexpected tragedy struck the family. Marlene's husband died suddenly of an illness, and the woman was left alone with 2 small children. Since then, she has spent most of her time at work, trying to provide for her sons alone. Although she struggled with this, she sacrificed everything for her children. 6 years after her husband's death, she met a man named Michael Warren, and they soon married. The man was a used car salesman, and after their marriage, he opened his own business in that area. By that time, Marlene was already making good money, but instead of spending all her money, she tried to save it. The woman invested in Michael's company and also helped him in the management. The man himself was also good at this business, and in the following years, it began to bring them decent money. Over time, Marlene and her husband expanded the business. They bought several properties to rent, and their finances took off. The family moved to an upscale Miami suburb called Wellington, buying a large house there. They seemed to have built a near-perfect life. But in 1988, Marlene suffered another tragedy. Her oldest son was killed in a car accident.
For the woman and her youngest son, Joseph, it was a huge blow. After all the difficulties they had gone through, their life had just got better when suddenly fate presented them with yet another test. Yet they found the strength to move on. After this tragedy, Marlene became even closer
to Joseph because he was her only closest relative. Her husband also helped her to recover from this loss. After the death of her son, the woman began to think about selling the properties that she and Michael were renting out. Despite the fact that this business brought in good money, for Marlene it was associated with constant worries. There were often situations when tenants delayed rent or lost income altogether. In each such case, the woman did her best to find the best solution. It was very hard for her to put people on the street because she was a good-natured person and well remembered the financial difficulties she experienced with 2 small children. On the other hand, she and her husband could not let people live in their homes for free, and eventually, Marlene wanted to get rid of the business so that she would no longer face such moral dilemmas. 2 years had passed since her son's death. The family was just beginning to recover and return to normalcy. But something terrible and unforeseen awaited them once again. On the morning of May 26, 1990, Marlene was at home with her son and 3 of his friends who came over for breakfast. Their kitchen was located so that they could see the driveway through the windows. At some point, the doorbell rang and Marlene went to open it. Her son saw a white Chrysler parked in front of their house. The next second, the woman opened the front door and saw a man in a clown costume holding 2 balloons and a bouquet of flowers on the doorstep. Marlene said, "How cute is that?" But the next second, something unexpected happened. The clown pulled a gun out of his pocket and shot the woman in the head. Her son and his friends rushed into the hallway where a heartbreaking sight awaited them. Marlene was lying on the floor with blood everywhere. The man in the clown suit looked at them for a few seconds, then got back into his car and drove away. My son called an ambulance, after which he decided to chase after his attacker. At the time, his leg was in a cast after an injury and the guy couldn't drive. He told his 2 friends to stay with his mother, asked his friend to drive, and drove with her in the direction the attacker had gone. but by that time the clown was out of sight and they never managed to find him. Marlene was taken to the hospital in an unconscious state, and the detectives began their investigation. The first thing they did was talk to everyone in the house. The woman's son said that he could not see any signs of his attacker. He was wearing a suit and makeup. He was wearing gloves on his hands and a wig on his head. The only thing the son remembered was that the perpetrator had very dark eyes. His friends added that the clown was quite tall, and his shoes stood out strongly against the costume. They looked like work shoes. A neighbor who was walking his dog near Marlene's house also saw the clown, but he was unable to share any significant sightings with police. Investigators put out a search for a white Chrysler and began searching for other evidence. Of course, Marlene's husband, Michael, was the first to be suspected. That morning, he had just left for the racing stadium in Miami, and at the time of the attack on his wife, he was not at home. From the first hours of the investigation, the police had several good reasons to think about his involvement. First, they found out that Marlene and her relatives really liked clowns. There were a lot of pictures and figures depicting these characters in their house. This suggested that the attacker knew this fact and chose such an outfit for a reason. Secondly, just 2 hours after the incident, the police received an anonymous tip from a woman who called the investigators and said they should look into Michael Warren and a woman named Sheila Keene. Sheila, who was 26, worked with Michael at his car rental company. Digging deeper, the detectives learned of rumors that there was a secret affair between them. Their relationship had been speculated about by some colleagues, so they immediately shared this information with investigators. Here, the police discovered another possible motive. If Michael was in a relationship with another woman and wanted to break up with Marlene, he had one problem. Most of the real estate and business that the family owned were written down to his wife. In that case, Michael would lose an impressive part of his fortune in a divorce. The police immediately checked the man's whereabouts at the time of the attack, and it turned out that Michael was in a car about 110 kilometers away from the house and had 2 friends with him. Investigators concluded he would not have been physically capable of committing the crime. Upon learning of the attempt on his wife's life, Michael rushed to the hospital and has not left her room since. Officers spoke with Sheila, and she stated that there was no romantic relationship between them and she had nothing to do with the crime. The woman added that she was at work at the time. Detectives also interviewed Sheila's husband, who said he was aware of rumors of an affair between his wife and Michael, but could not confirm whether or not it was true. The man added that his wife had moved out about a month ago, and in fact, they were no longer together. Although the police had no evidence to link Michael and Sheila to the crime, they continued to consider their involvement highly probable. Given that the husband could not have physically been outside his house that morning, the police wondered, could Sheila have been the clown? Because of the costume, none of the witnesses could determine the gender of the assailant for certain, and Sheila was known among her colleagues for her character. The woman was responsible for dealing with clients who were delinquent in their rent payments. In most of these cases, she had to take the car away from them, and in this, Sheila was adamant. Some of these cases led to serious conflicts, so the woman always carried a gun with her. After doctors removed the bullet from Marlene's head, experts determined that it had been fired from a .38 caliber handgun, remarkably the same caliber as Sheila's. The cops went to her again to examine the weapon, but the woman said the gun had been stolen or lost months before the incident, and the detectives were again left with nothing. The cops continued to dig deeper and learned that after Sheila moved out of her husband's house, she had moved into a rental apartment, and investigators also heard rumors that Michael was paying for the place. Here, a new interesting discovery awaited the police officers. All the while, their colleagues were trying to establish where the perpetrator took the clown costume, balloons, and flowers. At first glance, it seemed a very difficult task, but the detectives were lucky they found that on May 24th, 2 days before the attempt on Marlene's life, a woman came to the costume store near Sheila's apartment. The employee said that at the time, the store was closed and they were about to leave, but the woman persistently knocked on the door until someone opened it for her. She stated that she urgently needed a clown costume, a wig, face makeup, and a red nose. The clerks tried to explain to her that the store was already closed and asked her to come back tomorrow, but the woman was adamant, so the staff still sold her the items. There were no surveillance cameras in the store, so the police officers had to rely on verbal description of the woman's appearance. The salespeople told them that she was tall and thin with dark hair. Detectives showed them pictures of several women, and the officers said the customer looked like one of them, Sheila. As for the balloons and flowers, they were traced to a supermarket about a mile from Sheila's apartment. The salesman stated that the same items had been bought by a woman just a few hours before the attempt on Marlene's life. He described her exactly like the costume store employees, a tall, thin young woman with long dark hair. The salesman added another interesting fact. According to him, the female customer exhibited rude and to some extent even masculine manners. By that time, the investigation had lasted 2 days, and on May 28th, the doctors told the police that Marlene had died. Despite their best efforts, the effects of the point-blank shot were too severe. As a result, the case was reclassified as a homicide, and detectives continued to look for more possible evidence against Sheila. They asked the judge for a warrant to search her apartment. While the police were waiting, something else happened. They were informed of a similar car in a parking lot located 13 kilometers from the victim's home. Investigators got there and quickly verified that it was the same Chrysler the killer was driving. Inside, they found some long dark hair and orange fibers that looked like pieces of a clown wig. During a search of Sheila's apartment, the police found the exact same orange-colored particles, and they also found work boots that matched the witness's description, a similar model worn by the clown on the day of the murder. Despite all this, the police had one major problem. DNA analysis was barely used at the time, and without it, all this evidence was circumstantial. A high probability the court would have acquitted Sheila, in which case it would be impossible to charge her again with murder. Then the detectives wondered, where did the car the clown drove to Marlene's house come from? And then they found out something very interesting. An employee of Michael's company told them that 1.5 months before Marlene's murder, they had received a call from a man to rent a rental car. But there was one problem. This man had mixed up the phone numbers and he had taken the car from another company, the main competitors of Michael. When the employee told the boss about it, Michael behaved very strangely. Instead of telling the customer about his mistake, he told the man to just bring the car to the parking lot and leave the keys in the cabin. Then Michael asked the employee to bring him and Sheila to the parking lot and never to tell anyone about what had happened. The employee watched as they got into that car and drove away. It was the same white Chrysler. Notably, not long before that, there had been a serious disagreement between Michael and his competitors. The problem was that Michael was portraying his competitors in a bad light in his advertising, and they didn't like their brand being portrayed in a negative light. detectives decided to look into Michael's business in more detail. During the audit, they found numerous violations of the law, including tax and insurance manipulation. Moreover, they found evidence that Michael sometimes resorted to illegal methods of returning cars, even when customers paid on time and did not violate any terms. During this audit, the police also spoke to an employee who recalled something interesting. According to him, Michael and Marlene once had an argument in the workplace. When the woman left, Michael asked the employee, "How much would you charge to make my wife disappear?" Although it all sounded highly suspicious, detectives still had no evidence linking Michael to the murder. He was nevertheless arrested for various business manipulations. The court initially sentenced the man to 8 years in prison, but he was released after 4 years. Later, in 2002, Michael married Sheila and they moved to another state. Even though the detectives were never able to prove their involvement in the murder, they continued to watch them. The cops discovered that after the move, Sheila began introducing herself to everyone she knew under a different name, Debbie, and that she had dyed her hair from dark to blonde. She and Michael opened their restaurant, and it seemed that they had managed to build a wonderful life in the new place. However, soon rumors began to circulate among the employees of their establishment that Sheila had murdered Michael's ex-wife. Apparently, one of them stumbled across information about this crime and learned that the police still suspected them. However, detectives still could not prove their guilt, and the case finally froze. It wasn't reopened until 2013, and a new team of investigators requested a re-examination of all available evidence. By then, technology in the examination of DNA and other physical evidence had advanced to a new level compared to 1990. It took several years to examine the evidence. First, experts compared the orange flecks found in Sheila's apartment, the car, and the murder scene, and analysis showed they were identical. But the biggest clue was waiting ahead. Experts took a DNA sample from several hairs found in the white Chrysler and compared them to Sheila's DNA. They were a perfect match. Detectives thus obtained incontrovertible evidence that Sheila was in the very car in which the clown drove up to Marlene's house, enough to take the case to court. And the woman was arrested in 2017. At the time, Sheila was 54 and still denied guilt. She was denied the right to bail and awaited trial in a cell. As for Michael, he insisted that he had nothing to do with Marlene's murder and believed that Sheila had nothing to do with it either. He hired expensive attorneys for her, and the wait for the trial stretched on for years. In preparation for it, the police uncovered some facts not previously known. It turned out that a year after the murder, they were approached by a lawyer who had worked with Michael on his business. He said that about a year before the murder, Michael had asked him an extremely odd question. If the husband kills his wife, what happens to the property recorded in her name? Will the husband get it? The lawyer was surprised by such a question, but that didn't stop him from actually giving Michael advice. He said that if the husband asked his acquaintance to commit this murder and the court could not tie the husband to the man, he would get all his wife's property. But the lawyer went on to say something that later shocked investigators. He told Michael that if the killer wore some sort of costume, such as a clown, he would never be identified and would escape punishment. Another shocking confession came from a man whose father worked for Michael at the time of the murder. He confessed that his now deceased father had helped to run illegal schemes at extra cost, such as swiping mileage meters to sell cars at a higher price. But on the day of the murder, Michael asked him to do something far more terrible. He told the man to get rid of the gun and of the car. Apparently, the car in question was the one in which the killer moved after he abandoned the Chrysler in the parking lot, and the employee complied with these requests. Before he died, he told all this to his son and added another important detail. The man said that the second car was hidden in the river canal. As soon as the police received this information from his son, they combed the canal and indeed found the car there. Unfortunately, no evidence of it survived, but the very fact that it was there confirmed that the witness was telling the truth. The beginning of Sheila's trial was repeatedly postponed until finally a final date was set for May 12, 2023. But on April 25th, something unexpected happened. The woman pleaded guilty in exchange for not receiving the death penalty, which she would face if she were to lose her murder trial. Her attorneys explained the situation as follows. Sheila is innocent of the murder, but she fears for her life, which is why she took responsibility for someone else's crime. However, there is a much more logical explanation. Under the terms of the deal, she pleaded guilty to murder in the second degree, which implies a sentence of 12 years in prison, which is exactly the sentence she received. But furthermore interesting, the court deducted from that term the time the woman spent behind bars since her arrest, about 5.5 years. But that is not all. The judge reduced the remaining term due to the good behavior of Sheila. As a result, the woman was to spend between 16 and 24 months in prison. Her attorneys assured her that they could secure her release after the minimum bar of that time expired. So, Sheila was found guilty of murdering a woman in cold blood in front of her son and received a frankly ludicrous sentence for it. As for Michael, his involvement is still unproven and he remains free. Most likely he will never be charged again for the murder of his wife because there is not a single piece of evidence against him. Despite all this, the son of Marlene thanked the detectives who were able to get to the truth and did not give up on the case for many years. The death of his mother was the strongest tragedy for him because she was his only relative. Nevertheless, he was able to cope with the pain, opened his own small construction firm, and got his life together. Marlene and Yunlin had immigrated to Australia from China to pursue higher education. They met during their time at the University of Sydney and later got married, establishing their permanent residence in North Epping. In 1994, their daughter Jun Lin, commonly known as Brenda, was born, and she was soon joined by two sons, Henry and Terry. In 2002, the Lin family opened a kiosk on Rose Street, selling various news publications, newspapers, and magazines. Gradually, their small business began to prosper and generate a substantial income. The family was highly respected within the community, known for their hard work, as their store operated 7 days a week, and they were seen as loving and caring parents. Their eldest daughter, Brenda, grew up to be beautiful, intelligent, and kind. Henry was very sociable and had a strong interest in sports, while the youngest, Terry, kept up with his older siblings. The strong family bonds were reflected in their outward success as their business thrived. The family's income from the store had already reached around $1 million per year, making the Lin family one of the most prosperous and respected in North Epping. Having achieved success in their business, Min Lin and Yun Lin assisted a relative from China in relocating to Australia. Irene, Lily's sister, had been living in the same house as her sister and her family since her move to Australia, helping to raise the children. Min Lin organized the relocation of his parents, and the elderly couple settled in Maryland, located a 30-minute drive from North Epping. He also helped his sister Kathy and her husband, Leon Benagzi, known as Robert, with their move. Kathy and Robert, after an unsuccessful attempt to start their own restaurant business, settled in North Epping, living just a few minutes' walk from the Lin family's home, and both of them worked at Min Lin's store. On the morning of July 18, 2009, the store's regular customers were alarmed to find it closed without any prior notice. This was highly unusual since the store had always been open 7 days a week. Concerned about this, one of the store's loyal patrons contacted Kathy to inquire about
the reason for the store's closure. Kathy, unaware of why her brother hadn't shown up for work and failed to notify anyone, suspected that Min Lin might be ill. In response, Kathy and her husband went to her brother's home. Upon approaching the house, they discovered the front door unlocked. Inside the house, when they reached the second floor, they were met with a gruesome
crime scene involving the Lin family. Kathy immediately reported the discovery to the police, leading to the revelation of the Lin family's demise. Police swiftly arrived at the scene and found the lifeless bodies of 43-year-old Yoon Lin, commonly known as Lily, her two sons Henry, aged 12, and Terry, aged 12, and Terry, aged 9, as well as her 39-year-old sister Yoon Bin, known as Irene. Blood splatters were discovered throughout the house from floor to ceiling. In the initial hours of the investigation, the police became suspicious of Min Lin, the head of the family, as his body was not found. During the examination of the house, investigators also noted the absence of another family member, the eldest daughter of June Lin, known as Brenda. Upon inspecting the crime scene, it became apparent that the assailant had not entered her room, as there were no traces of blood and the room remained untouched. 2 hours after the police arrived at the scene, a man's body was discovered under a blanket on a bed next to Lily, indicating that Min Lin, the family's head, was not a fugitive but had become a victim of the attack. To ascertain the identities of the deceased, investigators had to turn to forensic examination, as their faces were so disfigured that their relatives could not identify them. The police began a thorough examination of every corner of the crime scene, but at that point, they had no leads regarding the motive for the crime or the identity of the perpetrator. Initially, upon examining the bodies, investigators believed that the assailant had shot the victims in the face from close range, given the extent of their disfigurement. However, later, the results of a forensic examination revealed that the victims had been brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt, heavy object, likely a hammer. Additionally, 4 out of the 5 victims exhibited signs of asphyxiation, indicating that they had been strangled before succumbing to their injuries. The time of death was estimated to be between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. Police learned that on the evening of Friday, July 17, 2009, a large family dinner had been organized at Min Lin's parents' home, attended by the entire family, including Kathy and Robert. According to the parents' accounts, the dinner had proceeded in a warm and pleasant atmosphere, with everyone enjoying their time together. The only family member absent was Brenda Lin, who was 15 years old at the time. She had left on a school trip to study the French language in New Caledonia with Cheltenham Girls High School and had learned about the brutal murder of her entire family through Facebook. This incident created a media frenzy and shocked the community. Many North Epping residents were personally acquainted with the Lin family and were deeply saddened by their tragic demise. The public funeral for the Lin family took place at Olympic Park on August 8, 2009, with over 1,000 people coming to bid farewell to the family. After the funeral, despite Min Lin's parents offering Brenda to live with them, Kathy and Robert insisted on taking custody of the girl, citing their advanced age, and swiftly formalized guardianship. Brenda returned to school, and Kathy and Robert took over the management of the store. The police continued their investigation, which was filled with rumors and speculations. One theory suggested that the initial intention of the perpetrator might have been a robbery gone awry. Another theory implied a connection to the Chinese mafia, as a few days prior to the murder, Min Lin had witnessed an armed robbery of a cash-in-transit vehicle near his store. It was believed that he was killed to prevent him from testifying, and the rest of the family became unintended victims. However, the investigation could not find any evidence linking the crime to the robbery witnessed by Min Lin. The idea of a home invasion was also swiftly ruled out, as there were no signs of forced entry, and nothing had been stolen from the house. During the investigation, it became evident that the murders had been meticulously planned. The absence of any foreign fingerprints in the house, except those of the family members, led investigators to believe that the killer likely wore gloves. Given that the murder weapon was not found at the crime scene, investigators concluded that the perpetrator had carefully planned the crime and had taken steps to dispose of the murder weapon. Detectives hypothesized that, to maintain control and prevent the hammer from being dropped during the attack, the assailant likely had it attached to their wrist in some way. At the crime scene, 24 bloody shoe prints were discovered, which were determined to correspond to a shoe size of 9. 5 in American measurements, indicating that the assailant acted alone. Investigators speculated that the crime was most likely committed by someone close to the family, who had access to the house, was familiar with the layout of the rooms, knew the location of the circuit breaker and alarm system, and was aware of Brenda's absence from the house. This idea was supported by the fact that the killer did not enter Brenda's room, as no traces of blood were found in there. The brutality of the crime led investigators to consider that it was driven either by intense hatred or overwhelming passion. Despite their suspicions, investigators still had no concrete idea of who might be involved in this crime. Extensive interrogations of potential witnesses yielded no valuable information. Mindline's parents, as well as Kathy and Robert, were questioned multiple times, but no significant information regarding potential wrongdoers was obtained. Kathy and Robert held a press conference organized by the police, urging the public to share any information they might have about the case. However, for several months, the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. The immense public pressure on the police demanded a swift resolution to find and punish the perpetrator. Consequently, a special task force was established within the police department, consisting of the most experienced investigators. They decided to re-examine all the evidence in the case that had not been thoroughly analyzed before. During the review of a recorded phone call between Kathy and the emergency services operator, towards the end of the call, the police noticed some unintelligible muttering in the Cantonese dialect. This recording was quickly translated, revealing a woman pleading with her husband not to leave her alone in the house because she suspected the perpetrator might still be inside. Investigators found it peculiar that Robert had left his wife alone at the crime scene, without checking whether the assailant was still in the house or not. This raised suspicions that he might have known for certain that she was safe and that the assailant had already left the premises. As a result, investigators decided to scrutinize Robert more closely, shifting the focus of the investigation in this direction and searching for additional evidence. During their investigation, detectives discovered that Robert had unrestricted access to the Line family home, as he had a key to it. Furthermore, he had a motive for committing the crime. After moving to North Epping, Robert struggled to establish himself in a business and had to work as an employee for Line. Following the Line family's death, all of their assets were transferred to Brenda, but as she was only 15 years old at the time, the legal guardianship of the girl meant that Kathy and Robert had control over all the family's assets and business. Police learned that almost immediately after taking custody of Brenda, Robert pressured Minlin's parents to vacate the house that Minlin had purchased for them. Police suspected that Robert, humiliated by his own failures and driven by jealousy, harbored a plan to seize the fortune accumulated by the Lin family through years of hard work. Despite Robert being the primary suspect in the case, the police only had suspicions against him. In the hope of obtaining more substantial evidence, investigators installed surveillance cameras in his residence as part of a covert operation that continued for 6 months. In May 2010, during another round of questioning with Kathy, investigators intentionally broached the topic of the bloody shoe prints found in the house. She disclosed that Robert wore Asics shoes in size 9.5. This revelation was a breakthrough for the investigation because the Asics shoe model was rare, as it had been discontinued in 2005, and these shoe prints were discovered at the crime scene. Just a few days after this, Robert was caught on hidden cameras inside his home, cutting up several Asics shoe boxes, moistening the torn cardboard bits in a bucket of water, and flushing them down the toilet. Armed with this information from the surveillance cameras, the police obtained a search warrant for Robert's house. During the search, investigators discovered a stain marked as number 91 on the garage floor beneath a chest of drawers. Subsequent laboratory analysis revealed that this stain was human blood containing a complex mixture of DNA, including at least 4 out of the 5 victims. Experts also determined that the composition of this stain matched the blood found in the victim's house. On May 5, 2011, almost 2 years after the committed crime, Robert was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was remanded in custody without the possibility of bail. His trial did not begin until May 2014, and he pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. The prosecution presented a wealth of new evidence against Robert. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case was the testimony of an informant from prison who revealed that while awaiting trial, Robert had confessed to him. He admitted that on the night of the murders, to leave his house without his wife noticing, he had given her a large dose of sedatives. Additionally, he shared that he had purchased the murder weapon, a hammer, from a budget store in town, knowing that the store had dummy surveillance cameras, ensuring there would be no evidence of the purchase. Robert also confessed to his cellmate that he had struggled to dispose of the hammer for a while, fearing he might be caught on surveillance camera recordings. Robert's defense attempted to convince the jurors to disregard these testimonies, suggesting that the witness may have had ulterior motives, such as reducing their own prison sentence in exchange for their testimony. In the end, the entire body of evidence came down to the informant's words against Robert's consistent denials. Despite the compelling evidence in the case, it seemed like the trial might fall apart and the court would not reach a verdict. However, a sudden and unpleasant revelation during the trial changed the course of the investigation. Brenda confessed to her attorney that Robert had subjected her to sexual abuse for many years, starting when he and his wife moved to Sydney and her family was still alive. When the girl moved into his home after her parents' death, his advances only intensified. This revelation led to the suspension of the trial for further investigation and the uncovering of these newly disclosed facts. Several months later, in August 2014, the second trial began. The prosecution now argued that Robert was driven not only by jealousy and greed, but also by a sexual obsession with his niece. Despite all the evidence against Robert, the defense continued to assert that he was a victim of public pressure on the police. They also cast doubt on the nature and timing of the garage bloodstain, suggesting that it could have entered the garage floor after Robert and Kathy discovered the bodies at the crime scene, and Robert might have accidentally stepped on blood while wearing the same shoes. Ultimately, this trial was postponed due to the judge's illness. In February 2015, the third trial began, which again led to no conclusive verdict as the jurors failed to reach a unanimous decision. In December of the same year, Robert was released on bail after spending nearly 5 years in prison without a conviction. The fourth trial began in June 2016, and once again, the jurors could not reach a unanimous decision. It wasn't until January 12, 2017, during the fifth hearing of the case, that the court delivered a guilty verdict, sentencing Robert to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In June 2020, Robert filed an appeal, which was denied in February 2021. He is currently behind bars, but has never admitted his guilt in committing this crime. Robin Brooks was born on March 30th, 1960, in the state of Virginia. In her childhood, she moved with her family to the small town of Highland, located in the state of New York. Robin was a cheerful and sociable person, had many friends, and always knew how to find common ground with people. She also had an older sister, Mariah, with whom she was very close. After school, Robin decided to move to California. In addition to the state's climate attracting her, the young woman had another weighty reason to move. Shortly before that, her sister also went there, and Robin decided to follow her. The young woman rented in an apartment in the city of Sacramento and got a job there. Several months later, she had the opportunity to move to a residential complex where her sister lived with her boyfriend. In addition to the fact that the apartments were very significantly better, Robin could spend more time with Mariah, and shortly before her 20th birthday, she decided to move. The young woman rented a separate apartment, and in order to pay the rent, she had to take 2 jobs. One of them was a cashier position at a donut shop located just a few meters from her residential complex. Robin chose the evening shift to combine it with her second job. The young woman lived in this complex for about 1.5 months, and during this time, managed to make many friends both at work and beyond. She was also glad to have the opportunity to see her sister every day again. On April 24th, 1980, Robin was supposed to start her shift at the donut shop at 4 p.m. but to the surprise of her colleagues, she never showed up. This was very strange because during her time working there, she never missed her shifts and usually came even earlier than scheduled. The employees waited for several hours, and eventually, one of them decided to go to Robin's apartment. The colleague knocked on the door, but there was only silence in response. After several unsuccessful attempts, he returned to the store and told them that the young woman was not responding. Colleagues were deeply concerned about this fact, assuming that something may have happened to Robin. Otherwise, she would have called to report why she couldn't come to work. During the short time she spent in their store, she had become friends with all the employees, and they were genuinely worried about her. Colleagues considered calling the police, but quickly realized that law enforcement wouldn't search for Robin because of missing a work shift. Then one of them suggested a non-standard solution. He offered to open the entrance door to her apartment to check if everything was okay with her. He and other colleagues headed to her home. Colleagues knocked on the door for a few minutes and ultimately decided to break in. When they were successful, a shocking scene unfolded before them. Robin was lying on her waterbed in the living room, and everything around her was covered in blood. Colleagues immediately called the police, and arriving officers confirmed that the young woman was dead. Her body had numerous stab wounds, apparently inflicted by an unknown assailant who attacked her with a knife and punctured the water mattress several times, causing its contents to spill onto the floor. After examining the crime scene, the police established that the entrance door had no signs of a break-in until Robin's colleagues opened it. The back door was also locked from the inside, leading them to believe that the killer entered the apartment through a window. Soon, forensic experts found evidence of this theory by discovering fingerprints on the windowsill. Medical examiners determined that the victim had been sexually assaulted and obtained the perpetrator's biological material. The apartment also contained small traces of blood that did not match Robin's blood type. Detectives concluded that the killer had cut himself during the attack, and the blood samples were sent to a laboratory. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not available in the 1980s, so they could not use this evidence. Investigators began interviewing acquaintances of the victim, starting with her colleagues. They said that the young woman had finished her shift at midnight the day before and went home. She was in a good mood, joking around, and generally behaved as usual. Nothing indicated trouble at that moment. Her colleagues added an interesting fact. That day, Robin mentioned that she had washed her bedding before going to work and was worried if it would dry before she returned. The bed in the victim's apartment was not made, leading detectives to conclude that the killer attacked her shortly after she returned home. Her sister also reported something troubling. A few days before her death, Robin mentioned that she was being followed by a man. She did not provide any details about this person that could help identify him, but she said he had come to her store several times and behaved strangely, trying to win her affection. However, he had not done anything to make Robin fear for her safety, so she did not take it seriously. The police were unable to identify this person because they had no characteristics to go on. They continued their investigation, talked to the victim's neighbors, but they did not have any leads. None of them heard any screams or sounds of struggle that night. The neighbors also did not see anyone unfamiliar visiting the victim. In addition, investigators learned that Robin did not go straight home from work that night. She went to a party with her friends for a while and left soon after. According to her acquaintances, she went home alone, and there were no conflicts or strange situations at the party. The police talked to everyone who was there and concluded that they were probably not involved in her murder. Ultimately, the detectives hit a dead end. They had no potential suspects. Robin got along well with her neighbors and colleagues. She had no boyfriend, and there were no people from her past who might have wished her harm. Blood and biological materials at the time could not lead them to the killer, and fingerprint matching against existing databases yielded no results. Investigators believed that the murderer was the persistent visitor to the store that Robin had mentioned. According to their theory, the man followed the victim from work to her home, learning her exact address. The next day, he broke into her apartment through a window while she was at the store and waited. When Robin came home, he attacked her, subjected her to violence, and killed her, then fled. Despite the complete lack of evidence, the investigation continued for some time until it ultimately stalled. It was only in 2004, 24 years after the murder, that the investigation was reopened. By that time, DNA analysis had become a widely used technology, and detectives hoped it would help them identify the killer. They sent blood and biological material to a laboratory where experts extracted a DNA profile and loaded it into the FBI database, but no matches were found. This meant that the killer had not been previously convicted of a serious crime, or that it happened before DNA collection was mandatory for such offenders. Despite this, a troubling discovery awaited investigators in the California State Database. The DNA profile of the killer matched another crime that occurred 3 weeks before Robin's death. At that time, an unknown man had entered another young woman's home, assaulted her, and fled, leaving the victim alive. It all happened at night, and the young woman did not see the attacker's face. She immediately called the police, and forensic experts were able to extract biological material from the man. Detectives tried to find new leads in this case to finally identify Robin's killer, but all of their attempts led them nowhere. Eventually, the case went cold again, and investigators were left periodically checking the DNA profile against databases in case the killer came into police view and his DNA was added there. This continued until 2017, when detectives heard about a new method called DNA phenotyping. Its essence is that genetics experts study a DNA sample and create an approximate portrait of the suspect based on their interpretation of the data obtained. This method is not precise and rather serves as an auxiliary guideline for police. With the help of such a portrait, investigators can look closely at similar suspects or exclude someone from the list. Detectives turned to Parabon Nanolabs, which conducted such research, and soon they prepared an approximate portrait of the killer. He turned out to be a man of African descent, but investigators could not find anyone similar among all the people who even remotely appeared in the case. Parabon Nanolabs prepared 2 portraits. One showed what the suspect might have looked like in 1980, and the other in 2017. Both images were posted in the media, hoping to get new leads. Relatives of Robin also had hope of finally finding out the truth, so they decided to offer a reward of $10,000 for any information about this person that would help find him. The police received several tips, but they all led nowhere. The identity of the real criminal remained a mystery to them. Despite this, investigators and Robin's relatives were not going to give up. In 2020, this case became one of the unsolved murders for which additional funding was allocated. By that time, a new DNA analysis tool was actively being used, which allowed even distant relatives of the DNA sample owner to be found. For this, at least one person related to him by kinship had to be in public or state DNA databases. The Robin killer sample was handed over to experts from Parabon Nanolabs, and they waited. It took them several months to study all possible relatives of this criminal, trace their genealogies, and finally find a suitable suspect. As a result, the detectives finally got a name: 71-year-old Philip Wilson. But the research results did not confirm his guilt. The police needed to take his DNA and compare it with the sample found in the victim's apartment. They learned the address of this man and began to monitor him. Considering that by law a person is not required to provide their DNA sample, the police have to resort to some tricks. They often try to get some item that the suspect has come into contact with. It can be a water bottle, a cigarette butt, and so on. Having obtained what they needed, investigators hand it over to experts who can extract a DNA sample. In Wilson's case, detectives also did the same. After obtaining an item with his DNA, they sent it to the laboratory. Experts found a complete match. 4 decades later, they finally found the probable killer, and on February 24th of the same year, he was arrested. The man denied his involvement in the murder, but the evidence spoke against him. The police also took his fingerprints, which matched those found on the victim's windowsill. Studying his biography, the detectives learned a lot of interesting facts. At the time of Robin's murder, the man was 31 years old and lived just a few streets from her complex. In addition, Wilson was a regular visitor to the donut shop where the victim worked. This confirmed the police's early theory that the killer was the same unknown stalker who bothered the young woman at work. The man had no serious criminal history, which explained the absence of his DNA and fingerprints in the databases. After his arrest, preparations for the trial began, which dragged on for several years. The process only began in 2022, and by that time, Wilson and his lawyers had prepared a new defense line. According to it, on that night, there was a consensual relationship between Philip and Robin, after which the man went home and someone else broke into the young woman's apartment and killed her. As for the suspect's blood found at the crime scene, his lawyer insisted that Wilson injured himself at work and the wound opened up when he was at Robin's home. The prosecution considered this version of events absurd. First of all, the victim was not in a romantic relationship with anyone. Moreover, she complained about a strange man who was stalking her at work, and that man was likely Wilson. The young woman was annoyed by his behavior and persistence, and there was no sympathy between them. Secondly, no other men's DNA traces were found in the victim's apartment. It would be strange to assume that Wilson left his biological material, blood, and fingerprint, while the killer left absolutely nothing. In addition, if we believe the suspect's lawyer, the young woman contacted him of her own free will. But before that, for some reason, she did not make the bed, which had no bedding. Wilson's defense also tried to point to another suspect who could have been the killer. It was Maria's ex-boyfriend, with whom she was living at the time. At the time of the trial, the man was no longer alive, and the lawyer used this fact. He tried to convince the jurors that the man was aggressive, threatened Robin and her sister, and also broke into the victim's apartment. However, nothing could be confirmed, so all these statements did not have a significant impact on the judicial process. As a result, Philip Wilson was found guilty of murder. His sentence was announced on his birthday. The man received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Currently, he is experiencing many health problems, so his time in prison is unlikely to be long. The victim's relatives thanked the detectives for finally bringing the case to a close. Her sister admitted that she still feels guilty. After all, Robin moved to California following her. As for the young woman who Wilson assaulted 3 weeks before the murder, the statute of limitations had expired for that crime, so the man did not receive any additional punishment for it. However, Detectives still wonder, did Wilson have other victims? Usually, criminals who commit such horrific acts with a few weeks in between do not stop and continue to harm people. It's possible that Wilson did not plan to kill Robin. He broke into her apartment and assaulted her, but she saw and recognized his face because he had come to her store repeatedly. Fearing a prison sentence, the man may have decided to commit murder and then refrain from committing other crimes. Britney Gregory was born on April 1, 1988, in Brick Township, in a large family, as the youngest of 5 children. After her parents' divorce, Britney and her older sister Brianna stayed with their father Joe Dunn, but they continued to maintain close relationships with their brothers and mother, Deborah. Britney was very intelligent, beautiful, excelled in school, and dreamed of studying criminology after graduation. She was passionate about watching various detective shows, read many books about her future profession, yet she remained an ordinary teenage girl who loved music, dancing, and hanging out with friends. In 2004, 16-year-old Britney and her older sister Brianna, who was then 20, lived in a small house with their father Joe and his new girlfriend Lori Peterson. Their father's house was close to the school Britney attended and was situated at the end of the street, bordered by a small wooded area. At that time, Britney had been dating an 18-year-old boy named John Fitzgerald for 2 years. The young couple had a very good relationship, and the boy was well liked by the girl's family. On Sunday, July 11, 2004, Deborah and Brianna went to the town of Toms River, located 15 miles from Brick Township, to visit their older son and his wife, who had recently had a baby girl. That same evening, around 8:30 p.m., Britney called her mother asking for a ride to her boyfriend's house. Her voice sounded very distressed, and her mother immediately sensed that something had happened. Promising her daughter that as soon as they returned home in about an hour, she would take her wherever she needed to go, Britney agreed and promised to wait for her mother and sister. About 45 minutes after the call, Brianna and her mother returned to the town and tried to contact Britney, but she didn't answer the phone. They assumed that Britney had probably already fallen asleep and didn't wait for them. When Brianna returned the next morning, she found that Britney wasn't home, and it appeared she hadn't spent the night there. All of Britney's belongings, including her phone, money, and documents, were in place. Brianna suspected that her sister might have spent the night at her boyfriend's house, but this seemed strange as Britney hadn't informed anyone. Plus, she left her mobile phone, which was very unlike her. Extremely worried, Brianna called all of her sister's friends and acquaintances, but no one had seen or knew anything. She also called her sister's boyfriend, John, who said that the last time he talked to Britney on the phone was Sunday morning, and they hadn't seen each other since then. Lori Peterson, their father's girlfriend who lived with them, mentioned that when she returned home around 10 p.m., she discovered that Britney wasn't there. Realizing that something was wrong, Brianna immediately went to the police to report her sister's disappearance. On July 12, 2004, after much persuasion, the police finally accepted the report on Britney's disappearance, although they believed that the girl had most likely just run away from home or was spending time somewhere with friends. However, Brianna insisted that such behavior was not typical of her sister. She couldn't have just left home without reason, as she was devoted to her studies, spent most of her free time at the library, and never left home without notice. Brianna also informed the police that all of her sister's belongings, money, and phone were left at home. She had already contacted all possible friends of her sister, but no one knew anything about her whereabouts. Commencing the investigation, the police first arrived at Britney's residence, inspected her room, and tried to find any clues. After examining Britney's bag and her phone left in her room, they found nothing suspicious. They questioned everyone residing in the house and ruled out the possibility of anyone close to Britney being involved in her disappearance. The police then moved to search the area surrounding the house. They checked neighboring houses in the area, inspected the surrounding areas, interviewed neighbors, attempting to find witnesses who might have noticed something, but none of the neighbors had seen anything suspicious. The police noted that the house was located at the end of the street, with a wooded area across the road, which they also thoroughly searched, yet found nothing suspicious. The police conducted numerous interviews with the girl's relatives, neighbors, teachers, but no one could provide any new information to the investigators. During a subsequent witness interview, Brianna told the police that shortly before Britney's disappearance, she had a fight with her boyfriend, John Fitzgerald, as she saw him kissing another girl. Nevertheless, Britney decided to forgive him for this incident and wanted to reconcile with him. The police became interested in this information and invited John Fitzgerald to the police station for questioning. John was genuinely shocked by Britney's disappearance and explained that the last time he spoke to her was a previous evening when she wanted to come over, but they argued again, and she hung up. He revealed that rumors about Britney kissing another guy at a party had caused their argument, although John himself hadn't witnessed it. Due to this, he decided to end their relationship and started dating another girl. John also mentioned that Britney handed him a letter expressing her desire to reconcile. In the letter, she regretted breaking John's heart, apologized for her behavior, and asked to remain friends. Additionally, John told the detectives an interesting detail that intrigued the investigators. Britney often used to come to his house through the woods that started right behind her father's house. There were no clues linking John to the girl's disappearance, and after successfully passing a polygraph test, he was eliminated as a suspect and released. Continuing their investigation, detectives decided to verify the information provided by Britney's boyfriend and spent 3 days combing through the woods adjacent to her home, but, to their great disappointment, found nothing. At this stage, the investigation hit another dead end, and the police had no leads other than the possibility that the girl might have decided to take her life amidst the argument with her boyfriend. However, Britney's relatives were outraged by this assumption as she loved life, was ambitious, aimed to build a career, and no argument with her boyfriend could have diverted her from her path to the extent of taking her own life. Just when it seemed the investigation had come to a halt, a woman approached the police. She, while walking in the park in the same area with her brother on the night of Britney's disappearance, noticed a passing car, a Chevrolet pickup. The woman even remembered the vehicle's license plate number. Upon checking this information, investigators determined that the car was registered under the name of a 23-year-old Anthony Geiger. The police decided to delve deeper into Anthony's past and found out that he had previously dated Bobby Jo, another sister of Britney. When questioned about this, Bobby Jo revealed that they had broken up about a month ago because she believed Anthony had developed strong feelings for her younger sister and was paying her too much attention. She decided to cut off all ties with him. Britney's friends corroborated Bobby Jo's account, mentioning that Anthony always seemed to look at her strangely and tried to flirt with her. Detectives speculated that Anthony might be involved in Britney's disappearance and summoned him for questioning. During the interrogation, Anthony denied being in the area on the evening of July 11. According to him, he was there on July 12, by which time the police had already begun searching for the girl. He didn't deny having a good relationship with Britney, frequently meeting her at parties with mutual friends, but he also denied showing any excessive interest in her. He claimed they were just friends, additionally stating that she was too young for him and he only saw her as a friend. According to Anthony's testimony, on the evening of July 11, he had an alibi. He claimed to have spent it at his place with his new girlfriend. Despite this girlfriend confirming Anthony's alibi, investigators still considered him a suspect due to his residence being close to Britney's home. After the investigation once again reached a standstill, the police turned to the media, spreading information about the girl's disappearance. Moreover, detectives from neighboring districts were brought in to assist with the investigation. Britney's family also actively participated in the search efforts, posting flyers in public places, visiting neighbors' homes, and questioning them, hoping someone might have seen or heard something, but initially this led to no avail. Unfortunately, such efforts didn't yield any results. No one had seen or heard anything relevant. At a certain point, the police began to consider the possibility that the girl might have been abducted from her own home. They conducted a thorough search at Britney's house and discovered her personal diary in her room. The contents of these entries were crucial to the investigation, as they shed light on the secrets surrounding the girl's family. In Britney's diary, she detailed her life, relationships with friends and her boyfriend, as well as her school life. A significant part of the diary contained information about her family. She wrote that every Sunday she visited her older brother who was in prison, that her mother left her when she was 9 years old and her father struggled with addiction, and she was forced to live with him and his girlfriend in the same house. Upon studying the girl's diary, detectives expanded the list of suspects and focused their attention on Britney's father, Joe Dunn, who had a long history of drug use and had numerous acquaintances, including suspicious individuals who frequently entered and exited the house. They also discovered that his girlfriend Lori Peterson ran a male massage parlor within the house where different men were serviced daily. However, it was revealed that she not only provided massages but also engaged in intimate services for money. Lori wasn't secretive about this fact and even distributed her business cards to neighbors in the area. The police theorized that considering the unfavorable environment present in Britney's home, it was plausible that someone visiting the house could have abducted the girl. Over 100 officers were dedicated to identifying everyone who had visited Joe Dunn's house in the last month. A meticulous investigation ensued, and on July 18, a week after Britney went missing, the police announced the arrest of a murder suspect. The Britney family was shaken by this news, as they believe her to be missing and her body had not been found. When Britney's mother, Deborah, saw the televised photo of the suspect, she immediately recognized him. It was their longtime family acquaintance, 38-year-old Jack Fuller. They had been friends for about 20 years. His daughter was engaged to Britney's brother, who was in prison. Deborah couldn't believe that he had abducted Britney. Soon after Fuller's arrest, the police disclosed a portion of the information that led to his detention. It all started with a call to the police station from an informant whose identity was not revealed. The caller reported that a few days earlier, Jack Fuller had complained to him about back pain, supposedly arising after he buried the girl's body. Jack assured the man that the location where he had hidden the body would never be discovered. His only concern was how deeply he should bury the body to prevent animals from detecting it. The detectives needed more information for Fuller's arrest, so they decided to conduct a secret operation known as the Sting Operation. They equipped the informant with a listening device, and during a meeting with Jack Fuller, he attempted to inquire about his crimes, including Britney's murder. Without hesitation, Fuller revealed to him that he buried the girl's body deep in the woods where nobody would find it, but he never mentioned Britney's name. Furthermore, Fuller stated that he needed to eliminate a witness who knew too much about the incident, pointing to his friend Tommy Long, who was present in the car during the meeting and didn't hear those words. Hoping that Tommy possessed crucial information about the incident, investigators apprehended him and brought him in for questioning. Initially, he refused to cooperate, claiming he knew nothing. However, the police allowed him to listen to the conversation with Jack where Jack planned to kill Tommy. Realizing the danger he was in, Tommy revealed that on the night Britney disappeared, he and Jack were cruising around and stopped by Britney's father's place. Jack went inside, but it turned out there was nobody home except the girl. Eventually, Jack returned to the car with Britney, who sat in the back seat. Tommy mentioned that he didn't understand what was happening and only asked, "What's going on?" Britney didn't respond, and Jack said he dropped Tommy off at home. He claimed that Jack dropped him off, and when he got out of the car, Britney, who was seated in the back, moved to the front passenger seat, and they drove off. The next day, when friends met again, Jack never mentioned the incident. They went to a car wash where Jack meticulously cleaned his car inside and out, which was unusual as he had never done that before. The car wash attendant even joked about it, but Jack got very angry and warned him not to meddle in his affairs, saying the attendant was risking his life. Tommy mentioned that as soon as he learned about the girl's disappearance, he directly asked Jack about it, to which Jack got furious and said he had taken her home and then left. He menacingly forbade Tommy from asking about it again unless he wanted trouble. Tommy speculated that perhaps Jack took Britney to the woods to take advantage of her, as that night he had expected intimate services from Lori, but she wasn't home. The detectives decided it was necessary to immediately arrest Jack Fuller. When they arrived at his house, he was holding a gasoline can and preparing to set fire to his car. Crime scene investigators thoroughly searched the vehicle and found blood, which forensic analysis identified as Britney Gregory's. The police also confiscated a vacuum cleaner from the car wash where Jack washed his car. Upon careful examination of the vacuum contents, experts discovered sand particles with baked blood, confirming it was Britney's blood. Despite all the evidence collected by the police, Jack did not confess to the abduction and murder of Britney and refused to speak. Detectives interviewed all of Jack's acquaintances, most of whom believed he was capable of murder. Fuller was a genuine criminal. He constantly committed various offenses, breaking into cars and houses for theft using and distributing illegal substances, assaulting a man with a baseball bat, physically resisting police officers, and he had been repeatedly arrested for drunk driving. He had been arrested more than 12 times in the past 10 years, and just a year before the girl's disappearance, he was released from prison after serving a 5.5-year sentence. Another intriguing fact emerged during the investigation. On the night Britney disappeared, one of the patrol officers saw a car parked by the side of the road at the edge of the forest. That was Jack Fuller's car. When the police officer approached Jack, he claimed to be searching for his dog that had run into the woods. Considering this information, the police organized extensive searches for the girl's body in the area where Jack's car was spotted, involving police personnel, canine units, helicopters, and volunteers. But unfortunately, they found nothing. While investigators tried to extract a confession from Jack Fuller, a woman called the police claiming she might know where he hid the victim's body. This woman had a less than stellar reputation. She used illegal substances and had been living with Jack for several months. During that time, she got to know him well, as he often took her to the same places. Once, he showed her a spot near a power line and said it was an excellent place to bury someone, ensuring nobody would ever find them. At first, detectives dismissed everything this woman said as fabrication, but she mentioned that the location was in Linewood, an area with sandy soil. The place was just 3 miles from Britney's home, prompting the police to organize searches involving law enforcement from neighboring districts and K-9 units. On the morning of Tuesday, July 27, 2004, 15 days after Britney was reported missing, 3 police officers with dogs discovered a spot with a hand protruding from the ground, bearing a bracelet with the name Britney. Detectives realized they had finally found Britney Gregory's body, confirmed by forensic analysis. Unfortunately, due to the body's decomposition, the examining expert couldn't determine the exact cause of her death, as there were signs of strangulation and a severe head injury. After the discovery of the girl's body, following advice from his lawyer, Jack Fuller decided to negotiate a guilty plea deal with the prosecution. On February 9, 2005, at the trial in the county court, Jack Fuller was charged with murder. During the lengthy legal process, he eventually confessed that on that night, Britney asked him to take her to her boyfriend's house, and he agreed. Initially, he dropped off his friend Tommy at his home and planned to drive the girl to her boyfriend's, but before that, he stopped by the roadside to smoke one of his illegal substances, causing Britney's displeasure. She started yelling at him and hit his hand. This enraged him, and he started punching the girl in the face and head. He stated that he struck her forcefully at least twice, after which Britney began gasping and making gurgling sounds while Fuller continued, ignoring the fact that she was already bleeding from her mouth and nose. When he finally came to his senses, he saw that the girl was motionless and not breathing. Realizing that Britney was dead, he decided to dispose of her body. On October 18, 2005, Jack Fuller officially pleaded guilty to intentionally causing grievous bodily harm resulting in death, and on January 13, 2006, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Britney's mother and sisters didn't believe Jack's account of what happened, as they suspected he subjected her to sexual violence. They questioned why he undressed the girl before burying her, but this remained a speculation as the examination couldn't determine whether sexual violence occurred or not. In 2008, Britney's school, Brick Memorial High School, initiated a forensic science program in memory of her, as it was something she had passionately wished for. This is the resolution of this tragic story. Who knows, if Jack Fuller, who had been arrested multiple times for various crimes, had been in prison, perhaps Britney would still be alive. Cassie Jo's daughter was born December 21, 1989, in the American town of Pocatello, Idaho. The locals were mostly religious and close-knit. They were all used to a quiet and measured life. As was often the case, none of them could have imagined that something so terrible could happen in the town. Cassie was a cheerful, kind, and responsible girl who never got into trouble. She was an excellent student, listened to her parents in everything she did, and helped her family whenever possible. In September 2006, Cassie, who was 16 at the time, agreed to look after her in-laws' house. Her Uncle Frank and his family were planning to go out of town for the weekend. Someone had to feed and walk the dogs while they were away, and Cassie had no problem agreeing. Even though their house was in the middle of nowhere, her parents weren't afraid to let Cassie go there alone for a few days. She had watched the house many times before in her uncle's absence, and with 2 Dobermans, it wasn't so scary to be in an empty house. Cassie had gone there on Friday, September 22nd, and was supposed to stay there until Sunday. In the evening, she called her mother and asked permission to call her boyfriend to watch a movie with him, but her mother said no. Then the girl said she would watch the movie alone and go to bed. The next day, Cassie did not contact her parents, but they did not care. The girl was responsible and independent, and what could have happened to her in their quiet little town? But the next day, Sunday, Cassie didn't come home at the appointed time, and that already alarmed her mother. After waiting a while, she got into her car and headed for Frank's house around noon. When she arrived, she saw that her brother and his family had already returned home, only there was a heartbreaking sight waiting for them. Frank's 13-year-old daughter, who entered the house first, saw Cassie's lifeless body on the floor. Her parents immediately called an ambulance, but the girl had been dead for days. The police arrived on the scene and immediately realized that they were dealing with a murder. Everything pointed to the fact that Cassie had been stabbed repeatedly with a sharp object. Upon examining the crime scene, they noticed several potential leads. One of the basement windows had been broken, and the electrical panel door was ajar. Frank assured investigators that he always kept the fuse box closed, and Cassie was unlikely to go in there since she wasn't an electrician at all. In addition, the back door was unlocked. It was through this door that the perpetrator could have entered the house. The version of a robbery was quickly dismissed as there was nothing of value missing from the house. The perpetrator took neither money nor any belongings. Almost immediately, the detectives encountered one suspicious moment. Both Dobermans were locked in a room on the second floor. A reasonable question arose. Who had locked them in there, and why? According to Frank, his dogs would not obey a stranger and might have attacked him. This indicated that it was unlikely that the perpetrator would have taken the 2 adult Dobermans to the room and locked them in there. Much more logical was the theory that Cassie had locked the dogs herself. Except, why would she do that? The only possible explanation was that a friend had come over to her house on a Friday night, and she had had to lock the Dobermans in her room to keep them from attacking her guest. The situation became more and more complicated. Based on the above, the killer could be someone Cassie knew well and had let into the house. The police, however, did not have to puzzle over this mystery, for the next significant clue emerged almost immediately. News of the murder quickly spread throughout the city, whose residents had never seen such a crime. Within hours of the discovery of the body, virtually everyone knew about it. While the detectives were working on the crime scene, a woman drove up to the house and said she had valuable information. It turned out to be Cassie's boyfriend, Matt Beckham's mom. According to the woman, her son did go to Cassie's house that night to see a movie. The girl hid this fact from her mother because she had forbidden her to have guests. The police questioned Matt and his mother. According to them, his mother called him at about 10 p.m. and demanded that he go home, but Matt refused. He said that something strange was going on in the house. The lights had gone out several times, and a window had broken in an unexplained way. Cassie was frightened by what was happening, so the boy decided to stay with her, but his mother didn't believe the story. At this point, she thought Matt was simply making it all up to stay with Cassie. Then she decided to pick him up herself and drove to the house. Once there, the woman listened to Cassie's account of the oddities in the house, and what was happening no longer seemed fictitious to her. Then she suggested that the girl go away with them, but Cassie refused. For one thing, the electrical trouble and other strange things had already stopped. Second, she felt safe in the company of 2 Dobermans. Deciding that there was really no cause for serious excitement, Matt and his mother left for home at about 11:30. The boy had no idea who might have killed the girl after they left. The detectives were in no hurry to take the young man and his mother at their word. At this point, the odds were not in Matt's favor at all. He was the last person to see the victim alive, and his mother's testimony might have been fabricated to protect her son. On the other hand, there was no evidence against him either. While Matt was under interrogation, medical examiners examined Cassie's body and drew some disturbing conclusions. The girl had been stabbed about 30 times with a sharp object, with a high probability that 2 different weapons had been used. This suggested that there might have been 2 assailants. In addition, Cassie had not been assaulted, which made the motive of the killers entirely unclear. All of this led the detectives to believe that Matt might have been the killer. They conceded that there might have been an argument between the couple during which the guy had taken up knives. That would have ruled out 2 versions at once, robbery and assault, with intent to commit violence. Then investigators decided to press the guy and offered him a polygraph interview, and it paid off. Matt suddenly stated that he had actually withheld one detail from the police. According to him, that night he called 2 mutual friends from the school where he went with Cassie. The guys' names were Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. They were friends with Matt and Cassie, and that night they agreed to come over to their house to watch a movie, except they didn't stay long because they found the movie boring. Shortly after they arrived, they said they would rather go to the local movie theater and left the house. As Matt was driving home with his mother, he called Tori and said he was on his way home. The guy had planned to meet his friends that evening, but they were already sitting in the movie theater. Matt explained to the detectives that he hadn't let his friends in for that very reason. They hadn't been in the house long and couldn't have had any useful information. Nevertheless, this confession closed the dog issue for the police. Cassie had locked them upstairs precisely because of Brian and Tori's arrival. Apparently, the Dobermans were familiar with Matt and were not aggressive towards him, but they reacted negatively to strangers. The police interviewed the guys and they corroborated Matt's story completely. When they left Cassie's house, they went to the movie theater for a late-night showing, so they had an alibi. Detectives looked into their backgrounds and concluded that the guys most likely had nothing to do with what happened. Both did not have any problems with the law and were in good standing. However, the police still decided to check their alibis and went to the movie theater. To their surprise, the cashier stated that Brian and Tori had not been there that night. The girl who worked at the cashier's desk had gone to school with them and knew them both personally, so she was sure that the boys had not been to the movie theater. This was suspicious, but the detectives were in no hurry to accuse the 2 friends of murder. They didn't rule out that Brian and Tori had lied in order to cover up some minor infraction. Perhaps instead of going to the movie theater, they had gone out for a drink or 2 to spend time in other, not-so-legal ways, but the cops couldn't ignore the false alibi either. They began to think of ways to get the guys to tell the truth. At one point, they even planned to start tapping their phones, only to find that it quickly became unnecessary. Detectives and city residents were in for a very unexpected twist. The very next day, after Cassie's body was discovered, Tori Adamczyk came to the police station with his parents, who forced him to tell the detectives a shocking story. Tori claimed that Brian had killed the girl and that he had unwittingly witnessed the crime. According to his story, that night the boys simply decided to scare Cassie and make a practical joke of their own. Before leaving her uncle's house that night, they discreetly opened the back door. Next, Tori and Brian lied that they were headed to the movie theater, but instead parked their car across the street, put on plastic masks and dark clothing, and walked back. After entering the house through the back door, they proceeded with their prank. The guys broke a window and started turning the electricity on and off, thereby scaring Cassie and Matt. They hoped that the couple would go down to the basement to check the electrical panel, but that never happened. At about the same time, Matt's mother arrived at the house, and Tori and Brian fell silent. They heard the woman talk, Cassie into going with them, then pick up her son and leave. As soon as the girl was left alone in the house, the boys started turning the electricity back on and off. They wanted Cassie to go down to the basement, but she was apparently afraid. Then Tori and Brian went upstairs from the basement and ran into the girl. At this point, According to Tori's story, his friend suddenly pulled out a knife and began stabbing Cassie, turning a harmless prank into a brutal murder. What happened shocked Tori, and he was afraid that Brian might kill him too. They left the crime scene and went to Tori's house, where they spent the night. All night long, the boy could not sleep and was afraid that Brian might attack his family. During this story, Tori cried, but the detectives thought what was happening was just a routine play. They knew from the medical examiner's report that 2 people had struck. So Adamczak's story made no sense. On the contrary, the detectives were well aware that if Brian had attacked Cassie, Tori had been in on it too, but they were in no hurry to accuse the guy of cheating. In the place of what they decided to play along with him, they needed physical evidence, so they reassured Adamczak that he had nothing to fear. It was further explained to the boy that they could only put Brian in jail if Tori showed them where they had hidden the clothes and masks after the murder. This worked. Tori told them that immediately after what they had done, they drove out of town and buried all the stuff near Black Rock Canyon. The detectives drove him to the spot, and he gave them the exact location of the hiding place. Near where the evidence was buried, the police also noticed ashes from a campfire. Tori explained that he and Brian first wanted to burn the stuff, but it didn't work out. The thing is, they had tried to start the fire with hydrogen peroxide and found to their surprise that it didn't ignite. The police dug into the cache and got an unexpected surprise. They hoped they would only get their hands on clothes with traces of blood on them. But under the ground, they found much more useful evidence. The masks, gloves, and other articles of clothing were covered with blood. There were also 2 knives, which the detectives immediately mistook for murder weapons. There was also a partially charred piece of paper on which Adamczak's handwriting detailed how he and Brian had killed Cassie. All of this might have been enough to arrest both suspects, but above her hole lay perhaps the most gruesome piece of evidence. Investigators discovered a videotape, the contents of which shocked them. Tori and Brian had recorded what they called an appeal to would-be serial killers. In it, the boys revealed that they were planning to kill 2 of their friends, Cassie and Matt. They outlined their plan and wished good luck to all the other killers. The tape also contained a tape from the day of the murder. Tori and Brian did some sort of interview with Cassie and Matt in the school hallway, then once again announced on camera that they were going to kill them. But the creepiest part came next. The next footage was taken after the murders, when the guys were driving in the car to get rid of the evidence. They were laughing, shouting, and cheering. Tori and Brian couldn't hide their excitement and were amazed at how easy it was for them to take someone's life. Of course, with such a set of evidence, Adamczak could no longer pretend to be an innocent victim. It was obvious to the cops that he was directly involved in the murder, and the guy, in tears, admitted that he had actually stabbed Cassie several times. In the end, both perpetrators were arrested, but the cops had another important discovery waiting for them. They noticed that on the tape, Brian was constantly writing something down in a notebook. The detectives searched his room and found it carefully hidden from view. The notebook contained a list of things to buy before the murder, but what followed was something really creepy, a list of 20 names. It turned out that the perpetrators were going to kill 20 people over the next 2 years, pausing for a month at a time. Among them were friends and teachers, and even relatives of Tori and Brian. The police talked to all the people on the list, and it came as a real shock to them. They all thought they were on good terms with the people who were actually going to kill them. Once under arrest, the guys began to shift the blame onto each other in the hope of avoiding punishment. Despite the fact that both perpetrators were 16 years old, they were tried as adults. The trials began in 2007 and were conducted separately. Then it was revealed that Tori and Brian had been inspired to kill by the cult movie Scream and even tried to imitate the masked maniac. This explained their choice of weapons and attempts to frighten the victim with a blackout. In addition, they idolized serial and mass murderers such as Ted Bundy or the Columbine riflemen. In other words, their only motive was to kill, and they wanted to turn it all into a show. The boys expected that after all the murders they had committed, they would become legends and make history. In spite of all that, medical experts declared them sane, so they should not have been indulged by the court. On April 17, 2007, Brian Draper was found guilty of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. On June 8th, Tori Adamczak was found guilty of the same charges. Both were sentenced to life without parole and 30 years on top of each for conspiracy. Adamczak's family resented such a harsh sentence. They felt that the court should have imposed a more lenient sentence because their son had led the detectives to the evidence. However, the judge was well aware that no credit was due to Tori himself. The boy was just scared and tried to blame it on his buddy, and that does not entitle him to any leniency. In the years that followed, Tori and Brian appealed repeatedly, trying to get their sentences reduced, but each time they were turned down. Most likely, the two will never get out of prison again, unless the U.S. authorities decide to cut them some slack. What we have in the end: undoubtedly, Tori and Brian are the most real psychopaths, but they were fully aware of what they were doing. They started preparing for the murders long before the attack on Cassie, trying to think through every move. It was partly fortunate for the police that the two maniacs were not brilliantly intelligent. They didn't even think about the fact that their fake alibis could be checked in a few minutes, and that would make them prime suspects right away. Now they continue to serve their sentences in the same prison, only now they hate each other for their mutual attempts to blame each other. Cassie's family has never been able to return to a normal life after all this horror. Frank's 13-year-old daughter, who first discovered Cassie's body, later tried to end her life. Frank and his family were also forced to move out of the house because no one else could be there. Even though the police department sent in experts to clean up the crime scene, the residents of the house never went in there again except to get their belongings. Frank had been trying to sell it for years, but couldn't find any buyers. Everyone knew the history of the house and didn't want to live there. For Cassie's mother, the only consolation was the fact that the killers had been caught and sent to jail, even though it wouldn't bring her daughter back. Megan Sharpton was born on October 24, 1987, in the small American town of Tullahoma, Tennessee. She grew up in a large and friendly family with two sisters and a brother with whom she got along very well. Her parents tried to give maximum attention to all their children, but Megan was closest to her mother. From an early age, the young woman helped her parents take care of her younger siblings. She also always tried to help her friends and loved ones. In her school years, Megan decided she wanted to become a nurse, so she enrolled in the local Motlow College, which was 10 kilometers from her home. The young woman also got a job as a waitress in a local restaurant and eventually moved in with her boyfriend Chris. In the summer of 2012, when Megan was 24 years old, she had only a few months left before finishing college. After that, she planned to immediately find a job as a nurse. Shortly before this, she also got a job at a nursing home to gain practical skills in helping the elderly. Despite such an intense rhythm of life, Megan tried to see her family whenever possible. On July 1st, her sister, who lived in another city, came home and Megan promised to meet with her. However, that evening, the young woman called her mother and said that she would be delayed. She was offered an interesting job opportunity, and Megan agreed to an interview that same evening. She was happy for this opportunity and promised her mother to come as soon as the interview was over. According to her, the job involved taking care of an elderly woman. However, time passed and there was no news from Megan. She did not respond to messages or calls. Her parents began to worry. They contacted her boyfriend, but he also did not know where Megan was and was not even aware of the interview. Despite this, the parents decided not to panic and wait for their daughter to get in touch. She was already 24 years old, and with her busy schedule, between studying and 2 jobs, the young woman could simply be busy. But the next day, Megan still did not show up. Meanwhile, in a remote area several kilometers from the city, at around 1:30 a.m., a group of teenagers noticed a fire in a field. It It was a hot summer, so they thought that the forest fires had spread to the grass. They immediately called the firefighters who arrived at the scene. However, an unexpected turn of events awaited them. Soon after the firefighters began extinguishing the flames, they saw a body laying in the center of the fire. When the fire was completely extinguished and the police arrived at the scene, they realized that a dead young woman lay before them. They immediately understood that a murder had been committed. However, the detectives could not establish the identity of the deceased. She had no documents, wallet, or phone with her, and due to the fire's effects, she could not be identified. The only thing that the detectives could grasp was two small star-shaped tattoos. The detectives studied the crime scene and concluded that the young woman was already dead before the fire started. This was evidenced by a serious head injury, which apparently was fatal, but they could not find any traces of the killer's presence. The victim was partially undressed, but from her t-shirt, the police concluded that she worked as a nurse. They also determined that they had not received any reports of missing persons related to this young woman, which also complicated establishing her identity. However, soon after the information spread throughout the small town, her mother saw a post on social media about a young woman with two star-shaped tattoos being found in the field at night and realized with horror that her daughter was the victim. Medical experts ultimately confirmed that she was indeed Megan Sharpton. They also found that the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the back of the head, confirming the police version that the young woman was already dead at the time of the fire. Moreover, she was killed in another location and then taken to that field. In addition, she was subjected to violence before her death, and the experts were able to extract a DNA sample from the perpetrator. It was immediately run through the database, but there were no matches. First, the detectives began searching for Megan's car, a red Mustang. She had been working at a restaurant that evening and left in her car, but it was nowhere to be found. This indicated that the killer most likely drove it somewhere where they could find substantial evidence. However, its location remained unknown, and the police started searching for potential suspects among Megan's acquaintances. Their first focus was on her boyfriend, Chris, and the detectives had a significant reason to investigate him. Megan's sister immediately told them that she suspected Chris's involvement in the murder because there had been problems in their relationship. Megan had been dating Chris for 3 years, some of which they had lived together. They shared an apartment with another roommate, and the police spoke with Chris, who denied any involvement in the crime. At first, he claimed that everything was fine between him and Megan, but eventually admitted that their relationship had been struggling lately and they were heading for a breakup. He insisted, however, that he had no motive for the murder and had a solid alibi at the time of her death. While the police checked his alibi, they decided to search the apartment where Megan and Chris lived. In the bathroom, they found the first alarming clue: bloodstains and needles containing illegal substances. At the same time, 20 kilometers outside the city, detectives found her car. It had been abandoned in a remote, deserted location. Inside, there were no documents or phones, which meant that the perpetrator might have taken or thrown them away elsewhere. The police reached out to the public, asking people to report anything similar they might find. Additionally, there was no signs of struggle or blood in the car, but they found something interesting: a note with an address that didn't exist. The detectives concluded that the unknown criminal had used this address to lure Megan to a deserted place to commit the crime. From the first hours of the investigation, detectives learned that the evening of the crime, Megan was supposed to go for an interview, but they had absolutely no leads in that direction. They believed that the non-existent address was given to her by the person who offered her the job. When the public learned the details of the case, many drew a chilling parallel. 6 months ago, another young woman of roughly the same age as Megan, who was also studying to become a nurse, disappeared without a trace several hundred kilometers from Tullahoma. What was even more terrifying was that this coincidence led everyone to believe that a serial killer was at work in the area, fueling the atmosphere of fear that the perpetrator would strike again. Meanwhile, the police questioned the couple's neighbor, who admitted to taking illegal substances. The neighbor claimed that Megan and Chris did not know about this and never indulged in it themselves. Experts analyzed the bloodstains and concluded that they did indeed belong to the neighbor. But his story didn't end there. He claimed that Megan and Chris had actually broken up a long time ago, and he had started seeing her recently. The neighbor also insisted that he had been hiding his addiction from her. With this information, the police began to suspect both Chris and the neighbor. Chris could have held a grudge against Megan, and the neighbor had a penchant for illegal substances, but there was no evidence against them. During his interrogation, Chris stated that he didn't know about the relationship, and by that time, the police had already verified his alibi. At the time of Megan's murder, he was indeed at work, so they ruled him out as a suspect. As for the neighbor, he didn't have a solid alibi, but analyzing his phone records revealed that he had been trying to call and message Megan all night in an attempt to find out where she had gone. Although this was not substantial evidence of his innocence, the police doubted that he was the killer. Both of the guys had their DNA samples taken and sent to the lab, but the results could take months to come back. Meanwhile, the detectives had a new lead. Chris had offered to help with the investigation during his last interrogation. On the day of Megan's disappearance, a man had called her old phone, which was at home, and said he wanted to talk to her about a caregiver job, and that Naomi had recommended her. Chris added that Megan had mentioned a young woman with that name who went to college with her, but he didn't know any details. So the police started looking for her among Motlow students and soon found her. She was the only student with that name, and the detectives got her address, but she wasn't home. They talked to her neighbors, and one of them gave them Naomi's phone number. She was surprised by the police call and said she barely knew Megan. They had a few classes together but didn't talk much, and she never recommended her for a job. In fact, she added that Megan annoyed her, so she wouldn't have helped her. The police were disappointed that this promising lead didn't lead anywhere, but they still had something more substantial. Chris gave them the phone on which the job call had come in, and the detectives had the caller's number. Experts determined that the call was made from a prepaid phone, so it was impossible to identify the owner's name. But the police traced the device to the store where it was sold, and there was a surveillance camera at the checkout. By studying the footage on the day of the phone purchase, they immediately saw the buyer. From these shots, the police immediately realized that he was buying the phone for some illegal purposes. Prepaid phones in America are in demand among those involved in criminal cases, as they do not need to provide their data to use them. And this person on the recording at some point took out his own phone from his pocket, indicating that he was buying an additional one for some questionable purposes. There was also a camera in the store pointing at the parking lot. The police saw the buyer leave the building and get into his car, which soon led to the identification of his identity. It turned out to be Timothy Gifford, who had an impressive criminal history. However, the man only engaged in petty trade of illegal substances and was not involved in anything serious. He was soon tracked down and taken to the police station. He claimed that he had purchased the phone not for himself, but for his acquaintance, a 37-year-old man named Donnie Jones. He said that Donnie was going to have an operation and he himself would not be able to go for the phone. As payment for this service, Donnie gave Timothy several illegal pills. Detectives were familiar with this man. He also had an impressive criminal history, but often acted as a police informant. Despite this, no connection between Donnie and Megan was traced until Timothy revealed something else. Donnie wrote to him that he wanted to exchange his pickup truck for a Mustang and asked for help with this. Timothy considered this request quite strange, as Donnie had 2 small children and the Mustang was far from the most convenient family car. However, he agreed to try to find a client. Donnie handed him the pickup truck and he noticed that there was brand new carpets and seat covers in the interior of the rather old car. Donnie explained this by saying that his wife had told him that the chances of selling the car with a refreshed interior were much higher. And here, the police suddenly discovered something that shocked them and glued all these parts of the store together. Donnie Frank turned out to be the husband of Naomi, who supposedly recommended the job to Megan. At this point, the detectives realized that they were getting close to solving the case. Unfortunately for them, the man's DNA sample was not in the database, as he had not been charged with violent crimes. They immediately went to Donnie and Naomi's house to talk to them. At first, the man claimed that he was not familiar with Megan, but within a few minutes he said that he had given her and Naomi a ride to college a few times. This seems strange against the backdrop of Naomi's testimony a few weeks earlier. Then she claimed that she barely knew Megan and they hardly spoke and did not get along in general. However, during the subsequent conversation, the woman did say that her husband had indeed given them a ride once. However, Donnie firmly insisted on his innocence. According to his words, on the evening of the murder, he was at home with his children. He allowed the police to search his house without a warrant and voluntarily provided his DNA sample. In addition, he denied asking Timothy to buy a prepaid phone for him. The police found no evidence in his house, and they had to wait for the DNA test results, which could also take months. 2 months had passed since the murder. Megan's parents received her nursing degree, and the event was dedicated to her memory. People hoped that the police would catch the ruthless monster who could kill someone else at any moment. Eventually, the lab results showed a complete match between Donnie's DNA sample and the one found in Megan's body. He was immediately brought to the station, but he continued to insist on his innocence. Upon learning of the DNA match, he changed his story and told the detectives that he had a secret affair with Megan, which he did not tell his wife about. This was supposedly the reason why he did not reveal this information initially. The police considered his story an obvious fabrication, but they had to release him. Besides DNA, they had no other connecting evidence, and finding 100% refutation of Donnie's words was simply impossible. Thus, the detectives were almost certain that Donnie was the killer, but they needed more evidence. Although they could not charge him with murder, they still managed to arrest him. During a search of his car, they found a firearm that he was not allowed to possess due to his criminal record. While he was in custody, the police had time to search for additional evidence. They did not have to worry about Donnie attacking someone else or running away. Soon, experts determined that Megan was shot with a firearm of the same caliber as Donnie's rifle. Detectives obtained a warrant to track his phone to see his movements on the evening of Megan's murder. They compared this data with the movements of the prepaid phone that Donnie allegedly never owned, and here the police waited for a long-awaited breakthrough. On the evening of July 1st, the prepaid phone was next to Donnie's phone and was moving along the same route. Detectives identified several key locations: Megan's presumed abduction site, the location where she was killed, and the field where her body was found. Both phones were found together at all these points. Donnie's family owned several farms in the Tullahoma area, and according to the investigation, he brought Megan to one of them after kidnapping her, where he assaulted and killed her. Detectives obtained a search warrant and found a significant piece of evidence: a partially burned scarf that belonged to Megan, which was a gift from her sister. This evidence, combined with Megan's belongings and DNA found at the scene, was sufficient to send the case to trial. On November 5th, Donnie was charged with murder. During the trial, new details emerged that only strengthened the case against Donnie. Experts examined his phone and discovered that he had repeatedly contacted other young women, offering them jobs as caretakers for elderly people. But all of these attempts were unsuccessful. According to the investigation, Donnie found Megan's phone number on his wife's contact list, contacted her, and said that Naomi had recommended her for the caretaking job. She agreed and he gave her a fake address, luring her to a remote location. There, he attacked her, took her to the farm, where he assaulted and killed her. He then took her body to a field and set it on fire. The final touch was a complete replacement of the floor mats and seat covers in his pickup truck, which he used to transport her body. Apparently, he was afraid that some bloodstains might be difficult to clean and the police would be able to detect them. As for Naomi, the police concluded that she had nothing to do with the murder and had no knowledge of it. She was at work that night, which was confirmed by numerous pieces of evidence. During the trial, Donnie claimed his innocence and everyone was preparing for a potentially lengthy process. However, when he realized that the prosecution was seeking the death penalty, he decided to make a deal with the investigation. He would admit guilt in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Megan and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, he later claimed that he had only made the deal under pressure and demanded a retrial. When the judge granted his request, Mann quickly returned to his original decision to plead guilty, as the death penalty was back on the table during the retrial. During the court proceedings, it was also explained why the criminal voluntarily provided detectives with his DNA sample without any doubt. Apparently, he hoped that the fire would destroy all traces and the police would simply have nothing to compare a sample to. But he was wrong. Despite this, investigators concluded that Donnie was highly unlikely to be involved in the disappearance of another student who disappeared 6 months before Megan. More suitable suspects appeared in that case, and Donnie's candidacy was no longer considered. After the verdict was announced, Megan's sister stated that the criminal would have continued to hunt young women and could have taken many more lives, but Megan stopped him with her own life. And finally, what makes this story even sadder is that in November 2013, Megan's mother, who had been doing everything in her power to help the police catch her daughter's killer, passed away. She could not cope with the devastating trauma inflicted on her by one cold-blooded criminal. Looking at Donnie's biography, it becomes clear that he could have been stopped much earlier. Among his many convictions was the charge of kidnapping a young woman, but that time he managed to escape punishment, and the criminal remained free. Who knows? Maybe Megan wasn't his first victim, but the police still don't know about it. A young girl was found dead in her own apartment in an upscale apartment building that was under 24-hour security. The police tried to solve this gruesome mystery for 2 weeks, and only dozens of surveillance tapes helped them discover the sad truth. Sasha Samsam was born on July 4, 1988, in New York City. After high school, she moved to Florida, where she graduated from a local university. After receiving her degree, she took a job as a social media manager for a real estate agency in Orlando. Her career took off quickly. She received solid bonuses and awards for her good work. Sasha's friends spoke of her as a friendly, sweet, and outgoing girl with a big heart. She was a member of several charitable foundations, taking an active part in their activities. On October 16, 2015, it was the last day of the soccer season in Orlando. Sasha and her friends went to the stadium to support their favorite team. The match ended in victory, and the company went to the popular Attic nightclub downtown to celebrate. After spending there a few hours, Sasha left the club around 1:30. As it turned out later, she hadn't told her friends where she planned to go. She could have gone home or to another bar. Before she left, she arranged to have breakfast in the morning with her friend Anthony, who was at the club that night. The next day, he arrived at the cafe at the appointed time, but the girl never showed up. She also did not answer her cell phone or social media messages. Such behavior was not typical for Sasha. She was always in touch and would not ignore Anthony, especially when they had agreed to meet in advance. At first he thought she was just slipping it off after the party last night, but several hours passed and there was no answer. Then the young man began to seriously worry about Sasha. Anthony, along with two of Sasha's closest friends, went to her apartment in the secure Uptown Place apartment complex, where she had rented an apartment for the past 6 months. When they drove up to her house, they found the girl's car parked in the parking lot. Inside the car, the friends noticed a box of children's toys. On that day, Sasha was supposed to go to a baby shower at her acquaintance's house, but the gift was still in the car. When they got to the door of the apartment, they started knocking and calling out for Sasha, but all they got was silence. It all looked extremely disturbing, and the friends decided to call 911. The squad arrived at her house around 8 p.m. The cops asked the guards to open the apartment door with the spare key and went inside. At first glance, there were no signs of a struggle in the apartment, but as soon as the officers entered the bedroom, a gruesome discovery awaited them. Sasha's arm and hair were sticking out from under the blanket of the bed. It was clear almost at once that the police were dealing with a murder. There were clear signs of strangulation on her neck. In addition, her torn t-shirt was lying nearby, the same one the girl wore to the stadium. This could indicate that the attack took place immediately after Sasha came home. The pendant she always wore was also torn from her neck. For Sasha's relatives and friends, this event came as a real shock. She had always been a kind and cheerful person, and it simply didn't make sense that someone would hurt her in such a cruel way. In talking to the police, her family and friends couldn't name a single person with whom Sasha might have had problems. Detectives began their search for evidence, and the first thing they noticed was the persistent smell of detergent in the apartment. The cabinet with the household chemicals was open. This indicated that the perpetrator was trying to wash away traces of his presence. He only partially succeeded, however. Detectives also found an empty contraceptive wrapper in the hallway and a shoe print near the girl's bed. Once in the bathroom, they found that the toilet seat was up, despite the fact that the girl lived alone. Experts found a fingerprint on it that didn't belong to Sasha. No other clues were found in the apartment. In addition, there were no keys, no smartphone, and no purse belonging to Sasha. Soon after came the report of medical experts. They confirmed that the girl died of strangulation. One of the doctors said he had never seen such severe injuries to the neck as in this case. This would seem to indicate that the attacker was physically well prepared. In addition, the experts determined that Sasha had been abused. They were also able to find a DNA sample from an unknown male on the girl's body. Unfortunately, there were no matches with him in the databases. In the meantime, the detectives began searching for witnesses and first questioned the security guard who was on duty that night. It was 33-year-old Stephen Duxbury, a former Marine. The management of the apartment complex had hired men with impressive experience in the police, army, and other specialized services, but even that did not help Sasha. Stephen said he saw the girl that night. He said she was very drunk and tried to get into the building, but she couldn't. The girl was missing her keys, badge, and smartphone. According to the rules, the security guard could not open her door without a pass, ID, or proof of residency. For this reason, Stephen refused to let her in. Sometime later, he went on a routine patrol and saw that Sasha had somehow made it onto the compound after all. He assumed that the girl had entered the building with another resident who opened the door with her pass, but the girl ran into a new problem. To get into the apartment, she needed a key, which she did not have. Each door in the complex also opened with a code lock, but Sasha couldn't remember the right code. She turned to Stephen and asked him to walk her to her car to look there for the keys again. Without the guard with his pass, she would no longer be able to get into the complex. Steve went with her, but there were no keys in the car. Sasha suddenly stated that she remembered the code to the door and they went back to her apartment. But there again, the girl was unable to enter the correct password. After that, the guard said he had to go back to his post. He promised to help her solve the problem if at the time of his next round, Sasha still could not remember the right code. However, the next time he went to patrol the area, Sasha was nowhere to be found. It was not until the morning that Steven noticed her in the company of a man he had not seen in the complex before. The guard failed to describe his appearance in detail, so the police had to look for this unknown man practically at random. We could only hope that this man might have been caught on one of the 15 security cameras set up on each floor of the building and near the exit. In addition, the detectives requested footage from cameras located along Sasha's route from the club to his home, a 10-block stretch. On such a stretch, there was almost a 100% chance that the girl was caught in the lens of at least a few cameras. After studying the footage from the club and the surrounding area, investigators immediately spotted Sasha. They could see her leave the establishment and head in the direction of the house. She stood out with her brightly colored outfit. She was wearing white pants, a purple t-shirt, and flip-flops. You could see in these dark shots that the girl was stumbling and staggering slightly. This indicated that Sasha had been drinking quite a bit of alcohol in the club, which matched the security guard's testimony. It was also apparent that Sasha left the club alone. A little later, another camera caught her, and this time she was walking in the company of two girls. The police showed their pictures to Sasha's friends, but no one recognized them. This led the detectives to believe that the three met on the street. It was important for the detectives to find these girls because they might have valuable information. To do this, they sent their photos to the local media, and soon the women were identified. During the interrogation, the girls said that they saw Sasha on the street. At that moment, two men approached her and tried to get acquainted with her. Given that it was late at night, the girls were afraid for Sasha and decided to walk home with her. This helped get rid of those annoying men. After walking some distance, the girls suggested that Sasha call her an Uber. Since she didn't have her phone or any other personal belongings with her, they went with her to her house and awaited until she got into the house. Given that she didn't have a pass, Sasha had to wait for some other guest to open the door. At 1:46 a.m., the cameras caught a man approaching Sasha and talking to her about something. It turned out that it was a resident of the complex who opened the door for her with his pass. Thus, investigators learned the exact time when the girl was able to get into the building. The man was no longer on camera, so the detectives did not consider him a suspect. The cops continued to study the footage and 20 minutes later noticed something else interesting. All the cameras in the building also recorded sound, and at one point, outside the camera's field of view, they heard footsteps. The investigators concluded that Sasha was working next to this camera in the corridor of the building. The next time she was spotted was at 2:25 a.m., but already in the company of a security guard. They headed in the direction of the parking lot and then returned to the compound. This also coincided with Steven's story. After that, Sasha was not caught on any cameras, and the detectives were at a standstill again. The police decided to question the guys Sasha had been in a relationship with in the past. This idea had to do with the method of murder. More often than not, strangulation is motivated by passion, and the culprit is someone close to them. The first guy's name was Taylor. He and Sasha broke up a long time ago, but continued their friendship. He worked as a bartender and was on duty until 9:30 p.m. on October 16th. He voluntarily provided the detectives with his DNA sample, which did not match the sample found on Sasha's body. A man named Ben was called next for questioning. In addition to being in a relationship with Sasha, he was also the last person she wrote to before she died. Detectives discovered that at 5:12 a.m., Sasha had sent him a text message that only included his name, Ben. This was very strange, especially when you remember that according to the story of the security guard and the two girls, Sasha didn't have her phone when she returned from the club. Investigators also learned that Sasha had planned to meet Ben this weekend. However, the man had an alibi. On the night of the murder, he was with friends. In addition, he voluntarily provided a DNA sample, which also came back negative. By that time, the detectives had finished examining all the available camera footage and noticed something strange. When questioned, security guard Steven Duxburg said that his shift ended at exactly 6 in the morning, after which he went home, but one of the cameras captured him leaving the building at 6:36 a.m., and that was not all. It was holding 2 large trash bags with red handles. Exactly the same ones were lying in Sasha's apartment. After speaking with the management of the apartment complex, the police learned that it was not the responsibility of the security guards to take out the trash. A logical question arises: why was Steven late for work for almost an hour, hiding this fact from the police and carrying garbage bags allegedly taken from Sasha's apartment? Given all these suspicious points, investigators offered the security guard a polygraph interrogation. When asked if he had ever entered Sasha's apartment, Steven answered in the negative, and the machine recorded the lie. Next, he was asked if he knew how Sasha died. 3 different questions came up: was she poisoned, attacked with a sharp object, or strangled? At the last question, Steven's pulse jumped sharply. Information about the girl's cause of death had not been released anywhere, and the guards simply couldn't know. Even when the police came to Sasha's apartment with the other guards, they were not allowed inside. It turns out that Steven could only know the correct answer if he was in the girl's apartment at the time of the murder. Despite all this, it is almost impossible to convict a person on the basis of a polygraph reading alone, so the police had to look for additional evidence. Investigators asked Steven to show them the shoes he was wearing that night. He provided them with a pair of shoes, and their soles did not match the footprint found in Sasha's apartment. However, the detectives also obtained a search warrant for his apartment, where they found other shoes, and they showed an exact match. Moreover, the fingerprint from the toilet in Sasha's apartment matched Steven's. By taking his DNA sample, experts quickly found a perfect match with a sample found of Sasha's body. Police learned even more gruesome details after examining Steven's phone. At about 5 a.m., he was searching on Google for how to quickly pick a combination lock door. The same one had been installed on the door of Sasha's apartment. Detectives finally found a severe bite mark on Steven's arm, as well as numerous scratches on his body. All this was enough to arrest the man and charge him with murder. With that set of evidence, no one had any doubt about a conviction anymore. According to the investigation, Steven saw that Sasha was heavily intoxicated and decided to take advantage of it. After waiting for some time after the girl entered her apartment, he opened the electronic log, and then he abused and killed the girl. Only one question remains unclear. Judging by the bites and scratches on Steven's body, Sasha struggled to fight back and most likely screamed. How come none of the neighbors heard that? The house she lived in was quite old, and the noise insulation there must have been extremely mediocre. After Steven had finished with Sasha, he began to cover his tracks. The man took cleaner from her closet, spilled it all over the apartment and even on Sasha's body. He then collected all the evidence into bags, which he later got on camera with. Apparently, he either didn't think about the fingerprint on the rim of the toilet bowl or he forgot. Steven's trial began in November 2017. His lawyer immediately demanded that several key pieces of evidence be excluded from consideration because his client had allegedly been misled. This included boots found in his apartment as well as polygraph evidence. The news media hyped the story as if the judge was ready to honor the request, but that never happened. All the evidence remained in the case file. However, even without it, Steven's chances of an acquittal were too small. The lawyer also tried to play on the fact that the investigation did not have any camera footage showing his client entering Sasha's apartment, but this attempt was developed by the fact that his fingerprints and DNA were inside the apartment. Finally, the lawyer stated that there may have been voluntary sexual intercourse between Steven and Sasha that night, and when the security guard left, someone else broke into the apartment and killed her. Of course, this attempt also went nowhere. The trial lasted only a week, which is very short by US standards. After a 4-hour deliberation, the judge handed down a verdict: life in prison for the murder and an additional 15 years for the breaking and theft. After the verdict was pronounced, Sasha's parents made a speech. They thanked the police for their quick and high-quality investigation and expressed their condolences to Steven's mother, who was present at the hearing. They noted that Steven's parents had also lost their child that day. Shortly thereafter, Sasha's family sued the management of the complex, which was responsible for selecting security guards as well as the manufacturer of the code logs. During the proceedings, it emerged that other residents of the complex had repeatedly complained about Steven's molestation, but management took no action. As for the lock, lawyers for the Samsam family insisted that the model did not meet security requirements. They cited as evidence an article that described how to open such a lock with a simple screwdriver in seconds. In February 2019, Steven tried to appeal his conviction, but the court dismissed his claim. In memory of their daughter, Sasha's parents decided to help the families and other victims cope with their grief. With such a tragic experience under their belt, they could find the right words and phrases to ease their suffering. The outcome of this story is very sad. The man who had been tasked with guarding people turned out to be a murderer. Just a few queries on Google helped him open the door of someone else's apartment without too much trouble. The two girls who met Sasha that night deserve special mention. They didn't just call her a cab on their own account, but drove with her to make sure she got home and was safe. Unfortunately, it was within the walls of her own home that the main danger to Sasha lurked.
Inga Lotz grew up in an affluent and well-off family. Her parents, Jan and Juanita Lotz, were quite prosperous and respected individuals. Her father was a respected professor of radiology at the University of Stellenbosch, and her mother was a physiotherapist. Inga excelled in school, demonstrated talents in singing and playing the piano, and was known for her kindness and responsiveness. After completing high school, she enrolled in the University of Stellenbosch, where she successfully pursued a bachelor's degree in mathematics and later continued her studies in the master's program. Inga was one of the top students at the university, always in the spotlight. Her pleasant appearance, cheerful demeanor, and friendly nature attracted a following. In 2004, Inga began dating Fred van de Veyer, a 22-year-old fellow student who had already earned a bachelor's degree and was working at a well-known insurance company in Cape Town. Fred came from a wealthy farming family, was educated, and well-read. Despite dating for only about 6 months, Fred was seriously considering marriage and had met Inga's parents, introducing her to his own. In early March 2005, Inga moved into an apartment in a prestigious residential complex on the outskirts of Stellenbosch. Considering the city's high crime rate and frequent incidents of violence against women, Inga took precautions for her safety. Hence, she chose an apartment in this residential complex, meeting high security standards including high walls with electric fencing, remote-controlled gates, and surveillance cameras throughout the complex. Inga gradually settled into her new apartment, furnishing it and making minor repairs. On March 16, 2005, the police received a call reporting the discovery of the body of a young woman with signs of violent death in an apartment under surveillance. Police quickly arrived at the crime scene and found Inga Lotz lying on the couch. Upon initial examination of the body, investigators identified signs of a brutal assault on the young woman. Detectives discovered that the victim had a broken nose and had sustained multiple deep blows to the head, neck, and chest with a heavy object, presumably a baseball bat or hammer. The girl's left arm showed significant swelling, while her right arm had numerous bruises and deep cuts on the wrist, and her legs and lower abdomen were covered in bruises. Detectives suspected that the victim had clearly attempted to defend herself against the assailant. During the examination of the apartment, investigators found no signs of forced entry or robbery. Valuable items were in plain sight, and the victim's personal belongings, money, and phone were untouched. The only items missing were a kitchen knife and the remote control for the gate of the residential complex. On the investigators' coffee table, they found a DVD disc box with a single fingerprint, and in the bathroom, a single bloody shoe print, presumably from the perpetrator. Considering the nature of the injuries inflicted on the girl, investigators speculated that the motive for such a murder could be intense personal animosity. Detectives found it peculiar that there were almost no bloodstains in the apartment, only a small puddle near the victim's head and a few drops on the floor. However, the character of the injuries suggested that there should have been more bloodstains in the apartment. Investigators also noted the almost perfect order around, which seemed strange given the bruises on the girl's body, indicating that she likely resisted the attacker. Taking all these circumstances into account, the investigating officer hypothesized that the girl's murder likely occurred elsewhere, and her body was later moved to the apartment. According to the forensic examination, the girl had suffered a severe blow to the head with a heavy object, possibly a hammer, followed by numerous knife wounds to the neck, arms, legs, and abdomen, totaling more than 40 stabbed wounds, as determined by experts. A few hours after the discovery of Inga Lotz's body, the news of her death made headlines across the country. The photograph of the beautiful, smiling girl appeared on the front pages of newspapers nationwide. Relatives and close friends of the girl were shocked and devastated by this tragic news, and everyone was puzzled about the motive behind the attack and the identity of her killer. Police continued their investigation on hot leads and learned that the girl's body was discovered by a young man named Christo Pretorius, a mutual friend of Inga and Fred, who lived adjacent to the girl. Christo Pretorius explained that on the evening of March 16th at 10:30 p.m., he went to Inga Lotz's apartment at the request of her boyfriend, Fred van der Vijver. Fred had been unable to reach her for quite some time during the day, and considering that Christo lived in the adjacent building, he was the quickest to check if everything was okay with the girl. Upon reaching Inga's apartment door, Christo rang the intercom several times, but received no response. He then started knocking on the door, but still no one answered. Christo listened closely and thought he heard the sound of a television inside. Turning the doorknob, he found the door unlocked. The apartment was dark, but the living room was visible in the light from the working television. Christo spotted the figure of a woman lying motionless on the couch, and upon closer inspection, recognized her as Inga, her head and face covered in blood. The young man immediately called the police and informed Fred about the incident, who became the next person interrogated by the investigators. Fred shared that he had been trying to reach his girlfriend, Inga Lotz, all day and grew seriously concerned when she stopped answering his calls. Worried, Fred called Inga's mother, who mentioned having talked to her daughter around noon and assumed that Inga might have turned off her phone to focus on preparing for an upcoming university exam. Despite this, Fred persisted in trying to reach Inga and around 10 p.m. decided to go to her home to make sure everything was okay. However, as he needed to first visit Inga's mother to obtain spare keys to her apartment, and this would take some time, he asked their mutual friend Christo Pretorius, who lived next door to Inga, to check on her. It was from Christo that Fred learned about the tragic death of his girlfriend. Interviewing Inga's friends and family and examining surveillance cameras at the nearest store, the police established the timeline of that day. In the morning before her university lectures, Inga briefly met with Fred. After classes, she had lunch with childhood friend Vimpai Boshoff, who incidentally was the last friend to see her alive. Returning home at 13:15, she allowed workers, who were doing minor repairs in her apartment, to enter. By the time they finished their work, she was on the phone with her mother, who mentioned hearing Inga escorting the workers to the door and locking it. At 13:36, Inga sent Fred a final SMS message. Later, Inga was captured on surveillance cameras at a store where at 14:55, she purchased a hamburger at a restaurant, picked up a DVD from a local rental, and bought a magazine before returning home. From that point, her phone went silent. Continuing the investigation, detectives learned that on the day of the murder, there was a power outage in the residential complex and at the gates, which were guarded entrances, for several hours. This was due to the work of electricians installing a fan in the trash chute room and construction workers laying tiles and repairing balcony doors. As a result, the home was left without security and surveillance for a few hours. At this stage, the investigators' suspicion centered on Inga's closest circle of friends and acquaintances. Among those who came under suspicion were childhood friend Vimpai Boshoff, former boyfriend Brown Kruger, friend and neighbor Fred Marius Botha, and, of course, Fred van der Viver himself. Both Vimpai Boshoff and ex-boyfriend Brown Kruger had alibis supported by witnesses and were excluded from the list of suspects. Later investigations revealed that Fred had a solid alibi. He was in his office throughout the day, confirmed by eyewitness testimony. Surveillance camera footage showed him entering the building at 11 o'clock and leaving at 1800 hours. He was not seen on camera at any other time. Despite this, detectives continued to suspect him, convinced that the perpetrator was someone Inga knew well, and the press and police believed that Fred, being a jealous and controlling boyfriend, fit this profile perfectly. Journalists uncovered some details about the couple's relationship that gave the police grounds to seriously suspect Fred van der Viver. Despite the outwardly prosperous appearance of Fred and Inga's relationship, it was far from ideal, with serious disputes and arguments arising between them recently. According to Inga's friend Vimpai Boshoff, during that lunch, Inga admitted that her relationship with Fred was on the verge of breaking up. She revealed that they had a serious disagreement that morning, and she wasn't sure if things would improve after that. Inga mentioned that she wanted to get engaged to Fred by the end of the year, but her father expressed concerns. From the beginning of their relationship, he noticed that Fred manipulated and controlled every move Inga made. The girl's mother also shared her husband's concerns. In their last meeting, she noticed bruises on her daughter's arms, which Inga attributed to gym workouts but wore a long-sleeved sweater despite the warm weather. The mother also witnessed a phone argument between Inga and Fred, during which Inga asked him not to come anymore and leave her alone. However, over the weekend, contrary to her daughter's wishes, Fred still visited. According to the mother, the boyfriend closely monitored the girl, telling her how to behave, what to wear, and with whom to associate. During the funeral arrangements, disagreements arose between the girl's parents and Fred, as he took charge of everything without consulting them. After a few days, when Fred was found rummaging through Inga's belongings in the closet, the girl's father asked him to leave their home and never come back. During the forensic examination of the sole fingerprint found on the DVD box, it was determined to belong to Fred. Consequently, the inference was drawn that Fred was in Inga's apartment after 1500 hours, presumably at the time of her murder, as the disc was rented by the girl at 1455. During the search at Fred's house, investigators found the young man's athletic shoes, and the footprint from them matched the bloody trace discovered in Inga's bathroom. Focusing on the search for the murder weapon, the police found that Fred owned a decorative hammer given to him by Inga's parents as a Christmas present, serving as a bottle opener. It was kept under the front seat of Fred's car and had never been used. Combining all the evidence and analyzing Fred's movements on the day of Inga's death, the police found inconsistencies. At that time, it was known that Fred arrived at the company where he worked around 11 a.m. and attended a meeting with colleagues at 1310. From that time until 1515, Fred did not use either his computer or his phone. Investigators speculated that he could have left his workplace through the company's parking lot between 1530 and 1715, remaining unnoticed by surveillance cameras. 3 months after the girl's murder, rumors circulated in the media that the police were about to arrest Fred. His lawyer advised him to surrender voluntarily, and Fred complied. The young man agreed to undergo a polygraph test to prove his innocence and successfully passed it. However, considering the substantial amount of evidence against him, Fred was formally charged, leading to his arrest. After a 2-year investigation, in early 2007, the trial of Fred van der Vyver began and lasted for 9 months, making it one of the most prominent and controversial cases in South Africa's history. Fred's family sold their farm to hire and finance his defense.
The key piece of evidence in this case was the fingerprint, and Fred's family enlisted an American fingerprint expert who made a sensational statement. He claimed that the fingerprint supposedly found on the DVD box was actually lifted from a cylindrical surface, such as a glass, and not from a flat surface like a box. This fingerprint underwent re-examination, and forensic experts determined that it was indeed lifted from a glass, while the one taken from the DVD box was apparently lost or mixed up with other prints. As the prosecution presumed, this fingerprint on the DVD box was considered to be the murderer's print, and the case against Fred was essentially built on it. However, mysteriously, this crucial fingerprint disappeared. This was just one of many investigative errors that would be exposed during the trial. The defense pointed out that 5 police officers, during the crime scene inspection, freely roamed around the apartment, confusing and destroying evidence. The defense also argued that Fred could not have left his workplace, committed such a heinous crime, returned, and managed to clean up within such a short time frame. Colleagues who saw Fred at work on that day described his behavior as calm and well-balanced. Additionally, the defense's expert provided evidence that the bloodstain from the shoe in the bathroom did not match Fred's footwear and might not be a footprint at all. Regarding the murder weapon, the decorative hammer, no blood or DNA traces were found on it. Upon re-examination, it was determined that it did not correspond to the size of the wounds inflicted on the victim. Consequently, the case against Fred van der Vyver fell apart in court, and in November 2007, he was acquitted. After that, the investigation into the case came to a halt, but the grief-stricken parents of Inga continued to fight for justice, insisting on a reassessment of the evidence and the reopening of the case. They did not want the memory of their daughter to be forgotten, organizing rallies, distributing pamphlets, and even hiring private detectives. In March 2012, when Inga's parents offered a reward of 1 million rand, about $80,000, for information that could lead to solving her murder, renewed interest in finding those responsible for the young girl's death emerged. Media reports indicated that during the investigation, detectives obtained information that Inga had received anonymous threatening phone calls for several weeks leading up to her murder. The calls were traced to a public telephone booth near her residential complex, but no clear suspects were identified in the surveillance camera footage. The content of the calls was not disclosed to the public, leading many to speculate and guess about potential motives for the girl's murder. At the same time, investigators explored the theory of the involvement of one of Inga's classmates in her murder. It was discovered that shortly before the murder, the girl had a serious quarrel with a fellow student over a research project. The dispute was so intense that Inga filed a complaint with the university's disciplinary council against this student. Although she was questioned by the police, no direct evidence linking this incident to the murder was established, and the suspicions against the girl were lifted. To this day, nearly 2 decades after the murder of Inga Lotz, the case remains unsolved. The circumstances of her death, bearers in the police investigation, the sometimes appearing and mysteriously disappearing evidence, the contradictory legal proceedings, and unanswered questions have made this case one of the most perplexing in South Africa. Over the years, several books have even been released based on this story. However, for the girl's family, the pain of losing their only child and the thought that the killer has not been justly punished have not diminished for a moment.
Courtney Clenny was born on April 21st, 1998, in Austin, Texas. She grew up in an affluent family, attended a private school, practiced dancing, and had an interest in theater. In her teenage years, Courtney became seriously involved in sports, developed an interest in the fitness industry, actively worked on her physique, and advocated for a healthy and active lifestyle, sharing this on her Instagram page, where she gained a significant number of followers. After finishing high school, she continued her education in college, studying to become a fitness trainer. After graduation, she relocated to Los Angeles. She took her online presence seriously, particularly on Instagram, where she registered as Courtney Taylor. Over time, she noticed that her followers were drawn not only to her workouts and nutritional advice, but also to revealing bikini photos. Courtney started her OnlyFans page, where she shared bikini photos, boudoir sessions, and fitness-related content with her followers. In a short period, she became a highly popular online influencer and OnlyFans model, accumulating a following of 2 million people. This attracted various advertisers, and she began successful collaborations promoting their products. Despite Courtney's young age, she had just turned 20 at that time. She had built a solid reputation as a serious businesswoman. She earned high income through advertising and could afford a luxurious lifestyle, renting expensive accommodations in prestigious areas, shopping at fashionable boutiques, and driving expensive cars. She had a wide circle of friends with whom she spent a lot of time at various parties and nightclubs. In November 2020, at one of these parties, friends introduced Courtney to a young man named Christian Obumsely. Christian Obumsely, an African-American, was born on April 26, 1994, in Dallas, Texas. After graduating from high school, he enrolled at Texas Tech University. Upon completion of his studies, he began his career at Jeffton's Healthcare Services, Inc. In January 2009, working as a customer relations manager. In 2018, Christian became the owner of Wiseman Peachtree LLC, but a significant portion of his income came from cryptocurrency trading. His estimated net worth was around $15 million USD. Among close friends, he was known as Toby, described as a kind and caring guy with a charming smile. Christian was also passionate about rugby and had a significant presence on social media. A couple of months after meeting, Christian and Courtney announced on their social media accounts that they were dating and had moved into a new luxurious penthouse at One Paraíso apartment complex in Florida. They traveled extensively together, spent time in expensive restaurants, and indulged in shopping at high-end boutiques. Christian also assisted his girlfriend in managing her business, finding advertisers, and boosting her social media accounts. Overall, the couple left a positive impression on their friends and acquaintances, and from the outside, it seemed like they were a perfect match. Both were in love and happy, as evident from the abundance of posts on their social media pages. Therefore, the news that Christian Obumsely was fatally injured during a dispute with Courtney Clenny shocked everyone, from family and friends to the millions of followers of the young woman. Police arriving at the scene found Christian Obumsely unconscious on the floor with a stab wound to the chest. The apartment was in complete disarray, with scattered clothing, overturned boxes, bloodstains everywhere on the floor and walls, and Courtney in her underwear, also covered in blood. The young man was quickly taken to the hospital, where medical professionals attempted to save his life, but all efforts proved futile, and he passed away without regaining consciousness. Subsequent forensic examination revealed that Christian Obumsely died from blood loss caused by a close-range knife strike to the subclavian artery. Detectives carefully examined the crime scene and began questioning Courtney, noting that despite the situation, she remained remarkably calm and confident. She narrated to the police a story of Christian's abusive behavior towards her, systematically subjecting her to emotional and psychological humiliation, as well as periodic physical abuse. Courtney also informed the police that they had broken up and their relationship had ended. However, Christian could not accept this fact and continued to stalk her. On the day of the incident, Christian came to Courtney's apartment and initiated an argument during which he began choking her. In self-defense, she grabbed a knife from the kitchen and struck him, which ultimately proved fatal. Courtney cried and expressed deep regret over the incident. Police, observing her condition, sent her to the hospital for psychological assistance, and she was discharged a few days after the incident. Thus, in the initial stages of investigating the incident, the only version available to the investigators was that of Courtney acting in necessary self-defense against violence from her boyfriend. However, relatives and numerous friends of Christian Obumseli did not believe in this version. They were certain that Courtney Clenny, for the most part, was the instigator of the disputes and conflicts in the relationship. Christian's friends were profoundly shocked by what happened, asserting that he was a very kind, sincere, vibrant, and intelligent person. His energy and enthusiasm were endearing to those around him. Friends also revealed that initially everything was good between Christian and Courtney, but later public arguments and heated disputes became frequent. Courtney, being well-known, struggled with the downsides of fame. She succumbed to the star disease, which hindered her from leading a normal life. She became demanding and capricious, spending nights in various entertainment venues where she consumed alcohol uncontrollably and developed a dependence on psychoactive substances. Under the influence of alcohol, she would experience fits of rage and baseless jealousy, during which she would yell at her boyfriend, racially insult him, and attempt to use force, pushing him and striking him in the face. Relatives of the young man persisted in their belief that Christian could not have been violent. As evidence, they provided investigators with audio recordings that Christian had made on his mobile phone shortly before his death. On one recording made during a car ride, Courtney can be heard using explicit language, yelling at Christian, including racial insults, and the sounds of a slap are audible. She then demands the car be stopped, gets out, and starts screaming at passers-by. Christian, in turn, tries to persuade her to calm down and come back, but the girl behaves erratically and takes a long time to calm down. On the second audio recording made in the couple's apartment, a dispute is heard, initiated by Courtney because Christian greeted a female acquaintance during a bike ride. Again, the recording captures a stream of profanities from the girl towards the young man and his unsuccessful attempts to placate her. Given this information and the unprecedented media and social media attention the case received, the police requested surveillance camera footage installed in the residential complex where the young couple lived. The footage revealed scenes of disputes captured in the elevator, compromising the version of Courtney acting in self-defense, as it was clearly visible that she was attacking the young man, grabbing him by the hair, hitting him in the face, screaming and insulting him. Concurrently, information started circulating on social media that the domestic violence incident with Courtney in April, which led to such serious consequences, was not the first. In her biography, there was already a similar case that occurred in July 2021 during a trip to Las Vegas when Courtney was arrested for throwing a glass at Christian Obumseli's head during a dispute in a hotel. Detectives also discovered that residents and security personnel at the complex had repeatedly called the police to the young couple's apartment due to frequent loud arguments and scandals. It became clear to the investigators that their initial version of Courtney acting in self-defense could not withstand the pressure of evidence. Thus, after a 4-month investigation and constant pressure from Christian Obumseli's family in August 2022, Courtney Clenny was charged with second-degree murder. At that time, she was in a rehabilitation center in Hawaii, undergoing treatment for alcohol and substance abuse. In addition to the charges filed against Courtney Clenny, the Obumseli family's lawyer filed a lawsuit against the company providing security services for the residential complex, claiming that they could have prevented the murder. During the proceedings, it was revealed that the guards on duty on the day of the murder had been notified of the ongoing dispute between the girl and the young man, as well as the fight inside the apartment. However, they stood outside their apartment door for 12 minutes and made no attempts to intervene in the argument. Despite being aware of the girl's history of past offenses, her unstable, erratic, and aggressive behavior, the guards remained by the door until Courtney Clenny herself called the police and reported that her boyfriend was bleeding. The investigation also cast doubt on Courtney Clenny's initial statements that she stabbed the young man in self-defense from a distance of 10 feet. This contradicted the forensic expert's conclusion that a knife strike of such force could only occur from close range. Additionally, it was noted that, at the time of the incident, there were no signs on the girl indicating an attempt at strangulation, as documented by the police in the crime scene report and Courtney's interrogation. In turn, the girl's lawyers claim that they have new evidence that Courtney Clenny became a victim of stalking and cruel treatment by Christian Obumseli and acted in self-defense, which they will present in court. The defense argues that the elevator dispute video, which circulated in the media and formed the basis of the charges, was edited and shown incompletely. In the full video, the girl is seen attempting to raise her hands against the young man and prevent him from entering the elevator, as the elevator opens directly into their apartment, and it is the only way to enter. Interestingly, Courtney's mother also confirms her daughter's claims of persecution by the boyfriend since she allegedly witnessed their turbulent arguments during phone calls with her daughter, where Christian was purportedly the instigator. Courtney's lawyers say that the previously published videos illustrate the toxic relationship between the couple but lack context. The legal team defending the girl stated that she is a victim of domestic violence and evidence. Snapshots without any context could hinder her from getting a fair trial, during which evidence will show that Courtney acted in self-defense. She will face the court for defending herself from a brutal struggle with her ex-boyfriend, which made her fear for her life, said the girl's lawyer. The defense hopes that the public disclosure of the full video will give the community the first opportunity since the beginning of the investigation to hear how the couple interacted and provide additional insight into their complex dynamics, helping to determine who was the victim and who was the aggressor. The case remains unresolved in court, and Courtney is still in custody, not yet extradited to Florida. During the court process, many interesting details of the case are likely to be revealed, and the consideration is influenced by Florida's Stand Your Ground law. This law complicates the filing of charges or the issuance of guilty verdicts when the defendants claim self-defense. The Florida prosecutor's office stated when the investigation is complete, the state attorney's office will review the evidence presented by the police department and take appropriate legal action in accordance with the law. For those unfamiliar with the Stand Your Ground law, it came into effect on October 1, 2005 in Florida. It allows a person to use deadly force when they reasonably believe it is necessary for their protection from the imminent use of deadly force, serious bodily harm, kidnapping, rape, or, in some jurisdictions, robbery or any other violent crimes. This is the so-called right to self-defense. In turn, the parents, brother, and friends of Christian Obumseli hope for a fair court decision, believing that Courtney Clenny, whom they consider responsible for the death of the young man, will face the appropriate punishment. Linda Slaten was born in 1950 in the state of Alabama, USA. She had loving parents and a younger sister named Judy. From an early age, Linda was ambitious and kind-hearted. She always tried to help others, which earned her many friends. Later, she married a man named Frank, with whom she had 2 sons, Jeff and Tim. However, as the years went by, their marriage became increasingly problematic. Frank developed an alcohol addiction and started to abuse his wife and children. Eventually, Linda left and decided to move to Florida with her sons. They settled in the city of Lakeland, where Linda's parents and sister already lived. Linda rented a house in a residential complex by the lake and dedicated all her time to providing for her sons. Linda took various jobs, but money was always tight for her. Sometimes she had to sell her belongings to pay the bills. She couldn't even afford a car, so her elder son, Jeff, had to ride his bicycle to school. Her younger son, Tim, played on a football team, and often he had to ask his coach for a ride home after practice to avoid walking. Despite the financial difficulties, Linda always strived to give her sons the most time and attention she could. She took them on hikes, brought them to concerts of their favorite bands, and overall tried to ensure their childhood was filled with positive moments. On the evening of September 3, 1981, when Linda was 31 years old, she waited for Tim to finish his practice and went with him to the neighbors who were hosting a small family gathering. Meanwhile, Jeff arrived home and wanted to have dinner, but there was hardly any food in the fridge. He got angry at his mother, hopped on his bicycle, and rode to his grandparents' house, who lived on the other side of the city. Later, when the whole family returned home, Jeff argued with his mother about the empty fridge, but eventually they wished each other a good night and went to bed. The next morning, Linda's sister, who lived in the same complex, went to her house to invite her for a cup of coffee. She knocked on the door but received no response. Thinking that Linda had gone somewhere, the woman turned around and was about to leave when she noticed that the bedroom window was open. She approached it, looked inside, and saw Linda lying across the bed. In the next second, the woman screamed and ran to the neighbors to call the police. One look at her sister's face was enough for her to realize that she was dead. Detectives arrived at their house and began examining the crime scene. Linda was lying on her bed, her clothing partially pulled down with a wire hanger around her neck. Based on this evidence, the police suspected that an unknown man had entered the victim's room, assaulted her, and strangled her. Soon, forensic experts confirmed this theory by finding a palm print on the windowsill. Linda often left it open since there was no air conditioning in the apartment, making it easy for the killer to gain access. While the detectives worked at the crime scene, the eldest son of the victim woke up from all the commotion. The investigators took him outside and delivered the tragic news of his mother's death. Afterward, they woke up his younger brother and led him towards the exit. However, at that very moment, as the boy passed by his mother's room, another police officer emerged from it, and through the open door, Tim saw his mother's body and froze in place until the officer pulled him away. Jeff and Tim, aged 15 and 12 at the time, were in deep shock. Initially, they simply couldn't believe that their mother was dead. Later, the investigators managed to talk to them, and the brothers stated that they hadn't heard any noise and hadn't even woken up that night. Despite having their own rooms, the detectives found this strange. Considering the building had very good acoustics, and given the brutal nature of the murder, loud noises should have been audible from the victim's room. The police interviewed the neighbors, who also hadn't heard anything. None of the residents in the complex had seen any suspicious individuals that day. Medical experts examined the victim's body and confirmed that she had been subjected to violence. They extracted the killer's biological material, but at that time, they couldn't conduct DNA analysis. The experts also confirmed that Linda died as a result of strangulation. Thus, the detectives had to investigate the case with almost no evidence. The palm print could only help them if they managed to find a suspect and make a comparison. Linda's sons moved in with their grandparents. They remained in a state of shock and constantly feared that the unknown killer would come after them. The fear was so intense that they slept in the same room as their grandmother, while their grandfather sat in the living room with a rifle. However, the detectives believed that the children were not in danger. In their opinion, the crime had solely a sexual motive and the killer must have known the victim. After speaking with Linda's relatives, they learned about her ex-husband, who had a history of domestic violence. He immediately became the prime suspect, but the police quickly determined that the man was in a different state at the time of the murder. Afterward, the investigators discovered that shortly before her death, Linda had started dating a certain man. They located this person, but he also had a solid alibi. The detectives checked all the victims' neighbors, comparing their fingerprints with the sample found on the windowsill. They then conducted a similar comparison with all previously convicted men residing in Lakeland, but they couldn't find any matches. Several weeks after the murder, Linda's sons gradually started to recover, and eventually, the relatives decided that the best option for them would be to return to school. Over time, it did help the brothers as they began interacting with friends again and gradually returned to a normal life. Tim rejoined the football team as his mother had always been proud of his accomplishments in the sport. A month after her death, he hung a photograph of his team in his bedroom as a reminder of how his mother had taught him to move forward and achieve his goals. Meanwhile, the detectives reached a dead end, failing to find a suitable suspect. They decided to go back to the beginning and reconsider why the sons hadn't heard any screams or signs of a struggle. The police reviewed Jeff's statements and noticed that he had an argument with Linda on the day of her murder. Furthermore, the teenager himself mentioned that he and his mother frequently engaged in verbal disputes. This made the detectives ponder. Could Jeff have killed his mother? They called him in for questioning and started asking various questions again. Soon, Jeff realized that the investigators suspected him of the crime. He denied his involvement, but the detectives continued to pressure him. They offered Jeff to undergo a polygraph test, and he agreed. The polygraph operator did not detect any signs of deception, but the police were not ready to give up. Soon after, they called him in for questioning again and even planned to bring in a hypnotist to put him in a trance state. Jeff constantly faced pressure, and one of the investigators directly accused him of strangling his mother. This led to the breaking point for Linda's relatives, and they demanded that the police focus on finding the real killer and prohibited them from approaching Jeff. Despite this, Jeff agreed to undergo another polygraph test, and after successful results, he was finally no longer considered a suspect. From that point on, the case remained stagnant for many years. Jeff and Tim grew up, got jobs, and started their own families. The murder of their mother still haunted them, but every time they contacted the investigators, they received the same response. No progress had been made in the case. In March 1999, experts extracted a DNA sample from the biological material found on the victim's body. 2 years later, a new detective assigned to the case compared it with samples from all the suspects, including Linda's 2 sons, but there were no matches. Even comparing it with the FBI database yielded no results. When Jeff met with this detective, he realized that they had been acquainted for many years. It turned out that the men regularly played bowling together with mutual friends. They talked, and the investigator promised Jeff that he would solve the case no matter what. Around the same time, Tim and Jeff heard about another unsolved crime that had remained unresolved for many years. After it received widespread media attention, new evidence emerged, leading to the capture of the perpetrator. That's when the brothers decided to approach journalists and share their family tragedy. They gave a detailed interview, and the story made it into the local newspapers. In September 2001, the detective received an interesting lead. He learned that a man named Jimmy Ulmer had abducted a young woman through her bedroom window a year after Linda's murder, for which he received an 80-year prison sentence. What made it even more intriguing was that during Linda's murder, this person lived in the same residential complex just a few meters away from her house. At the time of Ulmer's arrest, the DNA of criminals was not yet entered into a common database since it simply did not exist. The man himself passed away in '96, and there were no remaining biological samples. However, the detective contacted the perpetrator's mother, who provided several personal belongings from which the experts managed to extract a sample. Unfortunately, it did not match the DNA of the killer. But despite the setback, the detective was not ready to give up. He continued to search for new suspects, consistently asked the FBI to run the DNA sample of the killer through all available databases, and stayed in touch with Linda's sons. Unfortunately, in 2015, he encountered health problems that forced him to retire, despite his promise to see the case through to the end. At that point, Jeff and Tim had almost resigned themselves to the thought that they would never find their mother's killer. However, in 2019, a new hope emerged when C.C. Moore, a renowned expert in genetic genealogy, took on the case. She took the DNA sample of the killer and uploaded it to public databases, then began searching for any matches. Typically, such databases can even help find the most distant relatives of the DNA owner, who could be living in different parts of the world without the slightest knowledge of each other's existence. With this information, it is possible to trace their family tree, find common lines, filter out thousands of relatives, and identify the DNA owner. After conducting all this extensive work, Moore was able to pinpoint one family living in the area at the time of the murder. Within that family, there was only one person who fit all the parameters, leading her to conclude that he was highly likely to be the killer. When the detectives heard his name, they immediately realized they had come across him in old reports. His name was Joseph Clinton Mills, Tim's football coach, who regularly gave him a ride home from practice. He had never been on the list of suspects, but back in 1981, the police had taken a statement over the phone as he had dropped Tim off at home on that same day. None of the detectives even considered the possibility that Mills could be the killer. At that time, he was only 20 years old, and there was absolutely no evidence against him. So the police didn't compare his DNA and fingerprints with the samples found at the crime scene. The investigators decided to hold off on informing Jeff and Tim about this discovery. First, they needed to make sure that Mills was truly behind their mother's murder. After studying his biography, they found out that in 1984, Mills was arrested for forgery of a will, and his fingerprints were taken, which are still kept in a paper archive to this day. Experts compared them with the fingerprints found on the victim's windowsill and obtained a perfect match. After 38 years, they finally learned the identity of the probable killer. Immediately after this revelation, the detectives moved on to the final step, obtaining a DNA sample from Mills to compare it with the biological material from the victim's body. They discovered that the man still lived in the same house as in 1981. Mills was now 58 years old, owned a small business, was married, and had children and grandchildren. The detectives monitored him for several weeks, hoping to obtain some item with his DNA. It could have been a cigarette butt, a coffee cup, a bottle, and so on. However, they never had the opportunity, so the police decided to discreetly retrieve his trash. They handed the bag to the laboratory, where experts tried to find an item with his DNA, and soon they succeeded. The results were not long in coming. Mills' DNA matched completely with the sample found on Linda's body. Afterward, the detectives met with her sons to inform them of the progress in the case. They were both shocked, but Tim had a much harder time accepting it. He couldn't believe that his football coach turned out to be the same monster who had killed his mother. Tim respected him and looked up to him, and what's more, Mills continued to give him rides home from practice even after the murder. The man constantly encouraged him and always asked if there were any developments in his mother's case. For all these years, a photo of his football team hung in Tim's old bedroom with the monster who killed his mom standing right behind him. In the same year Mills was arrested, he remained calm and didn't even ask what he was being accused of. When brought in for questioning and asked about Linda's murder, he claimed to have no involvement. According to him, he dropped off Tim and left. Mills insisted that he never entered their house, but the detectives knew it was a lie. They informed him about the DNA and fingerprint match, after which the suspect suddenly changed his version of events. Now, Mills insisted that on that night, Linda herself invited him to sneak into her bedroom through the window for an intimate encounter. Then she asked him to lightly choke her with a hanger, but Mills miscalculated his strength and ended up killing her. Of course, the detectives didn't believe this story for a second, considering all the existing evidence. They had a much more plausible theory. Based on the fact that Mills had repeatedly given Tim rides home, he had seen his mother and could have targeted her as a victim. On the evening of the murder, he dropped off the boy, who immediately went to a party at the neighbor's house with his mother. Mills took advantage of the fact that no one would be home in their house. He drove away for some distance and then returned on foot, sneaking into Linda's bedroom through the window and hiding in the closet. He spent several hours there, waiting for everyone to go to sleep. In that same closet, he took a wire hanger and used it as a murder weapon. After subjecting the victim to violence, he left the house through the window. Based on all the available evidence, charges were brought against Mills for the murder, and the case was handed over to court. In the state of Florida, the death penalty was a possible sentence for such a crime. And on February 9, 2022, Mills decided to make a deal with the prosecution to avoid this fate. He confessed to the murder, but under the conditions of the agreement, he was not required to disclose the details of the crime. Linda's sons were unhappy with this fact. In the courtroom, Tim shouted at his coach, demanding to know why he took his mother away from him. But the man remained silent, looking down. Only when given the opportunity for a final statement, Mills said, "I'm a good person. I'm not who they're trying to portray me as." This angered the brothers even more, but ultimately, they were grateful to the investigators for bringing the case to a conclusion and finally finding the killer. Mills was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the verdict was delivered, Jeff and Tim promised to try to live honorable lives and dedicate themselves to their families, as that is what their mother would have wanted.